Hey there, welcome to my channel. I just started this channel, and your support means the world to me. It helps me keep sharing the stories I love. This video is completely ad-free and designed to help you fall asleep fast and comfortably. Like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of stories I share here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to feel connected with all of you. Now, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan if you like, and let's drift into tonight's stories together. Story 1. The town's cemetery has no graves, but I keep hearing screams underground. My therapist, a woman with a kind face and a voice as soft as felt, called it a geographical cure. The idea that a change of scenery could somehow cauterize the gaping wound in my life. I didn't have the heart to tell her that my grief wasn't a geographical problem. It was a parasitic entity that had taken up residence behind my eyes, and it would pack a bag and come with me wherever I went. Still, the thought of leaving the city, with its million tiny ghosts of a life I'd once shared with my wife Anna, was a compelling one. So I packed my laptop, a few boxes of books, and the metaphorical suitcase full of sorrow, and drove north. The town I chose was called Havenwood. I'd found it on a list of America's most quaint and quiet towns, a bit of online clickbait that suddenly felt like a lifeline. The picture showed a postcard-perfect hamlet nestled in a valley of rolling green hills, a place that looked like it had been put under a glass dome sometime in the 1950s and forgotten about. It was exactly the kind of anesthetic silence I was looking for, and for the first week, it was. I rented a small, furnished cottage at the edge of town, a place that smelled of lemon polish and old wood. The locals were friendly in a cautious, practiced way. They smiled from behind the counters of the general store and the single-pump gas station, their eyes holding a placid, almost unnerving calm. It was a town that seemed to be holding its breath, perpetually waiting for a storm that never came. It was on a walk, during that hazy liminal hour between dusk and true night, that I found the cemetery. It lay on a gentle slope just west of the town, surrounded by a magnificent wrought iron fence that was a masterpiece of Gothic curlicues and spear points. The gate was a grand arched affair with the words Havenwood Memorial Green forged into the iron. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning a low, mournful protest, and stepped inside. The air within the gates was different, cooler, heavier. The grass was a perfect emerald carpet, impossibly lush and manicured, rolling over the soft contours of the hill. Ancient, weeping willows stood like silent, grieving giants, their branches stirring in a breeze I couldn't feel. It was beautiful, and it was profoundly wrong. There were no graves, not a single headstone, no marble angels, no granite crosses, no humble, weathered markers. There were no raised mounds of earth, no flower arrangements, no tiny flags. It was a park, a beautiful, empty, and utterly soulless park that called itself a cemetery. I walked the entire perimeter, my footsteps unnaturally loud on a pristine lawn, a growing sense of dislocation crawling up my spine. A cemetery is a place of names, of dates, of remembrance etched in stone. This place was a blank page, a void. I was standing near the center of the green, watching the last vestiges of sunset bleed across the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange when I heard it for the first time. It was faint, so faint I almost missed it. A high, thin sound, like a distant siren or the cry of a hawk. I tilted my head, straining to hear it over the blood rushing in my own ears. The sound came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was a voice, a human voice, stretched and distorted by distance and desperation. It was a scream, and it was coming from the ground beneath my feet. I froze, my body going rigid. The sound was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a silence that was now charged with a terrible, new significance. It had to be the wind, an animal. My mind, raw and frayed from months of grief, was playing tricks on me. I told myself this, repeated it like a mantra as I backed away from the center of the lawn, my eyes wide, scanning the empty, perfect grass. I didn't stop walking until the iron gate clanged shut behind me, the sound echoing in the twilight like a cell door locking. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. My cottage was old, the pipes probably groaned. The woods were full of foxes and bobcats whose cries could sound unnervingly human. But the memory of the sound, its specific human tenor of agony, was a fishhook in my mind. I went into town for coffee, needing the comforting banality of human interaction. The diner was a small, bright place called the Morning Glory, and the woman behind the counter, a middle-aged lady named Brenda with a beehive of impossibly blonde hair, slid a mug in front of me with a practiced, friendly smile. "You're the writer, aren't you?" she asked, her voice cheerful. "Renting the old Miller place." News traveled fast in Havenwood. "That's me," I said, forcing a smile in return. "Leo Vance." "Brenda, welcome to Havenwood. Hope you're finding the peace and quiet you were looking for." Her smile was so open, so genuine, that I felt a surge of courage. "I am. It's a beautiful town. I was walking by the cemetery last night, the Memorial Green." Brenda's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes tightened, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The light behind them dimmed for a fraction of a second. "Oh, yes, our green," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Isn't it lovely? So much nicer than a field full of sad old stones, don't you think?" "It's certainly unique," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I've never seen a cemetery without any graves before. What do you do? Cremation?" She wiped down a perfectly clean section of the counter. "We don't believe in dwelling on the end, Mr. Vance. We believe in celebrating life. When someone passes, their spirit is freed, returned to the valley. The green is a place for quiet reflection on that freedom. It's a place for life, not death." The answer was so polished, so rehearsed. It was like she was reading from a town brochure. It was a neat, tidy deflection that answered nothing at all. I wanted to press, to ask her if she'd ever heard strange noises there, but the look in her eyes, a sudden hard glint of warning behind the friendly facade, stopped me. "Don't ask," the look said. "You don't want to know." I couldn't stay away. The Memorial Green drew me back that evening, a moth to a flame I knew would burn me. This time, I was prepared. I brought a high-powered directional microphone, a relic from my brief, ill-fated foray into podcasting. I sat on a stone bench just inside the gates, the headphones pressed tight against my ears, and pointed the microphone at the center of the lawn. For an hour, there was nothing but the soft, rustling sound of the willow leaves and the low, ambient hum of a world settling down for the night. I was starting to feel foolish, a paranoid man chasing auditory ghosts. Then, through the headphones, the sound erupted. It wasn't a single scream this time. It was a chorus, a cacophony of voices, muffled and overlapping, rising from the earth. They were faint, but the microphone amplified them, bringing their horror into sharp, terrifying focus. I could distinguish individual voices now, a woman weeping hysterically, a man shouting a single, guttural word over and over again, and a child crying for its mother. They weren't ghosts. They weren't echoes. They were the sounds of living people in unbearable agony. My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the microphone. I ripped the headphones off, my heart jackhammering against my ribs. The sounds vanished, replaced by the placid evening quiet. The disconnect was dizzying, schizophrenic. The serene, beautiful park, and the charnel house of sound that existed just beneath its surface. My journalistic instincts, dormant for so long, roared back to life, fueled by a potent cocktail of terror and outrage. This was not a haunting. This was a crime, a monstrous, ongoing crime, hidden beneath a blanket of perfect green grass. The Havenwood Town Library was a small brick building that smelled of dust and decaying paper. The librarian was a man named Mr. Abernathy, a creature who seemed to have been grown in the dark, dusty stacks he inhabited. He was impossibly old and thin, with skin like parchment stretched over a bird skull, and he watched me with watery, faded blue eyes as I browsed the meager local history section. The official town histories were useless, filled with the same kind of bland, cheerful prose as Brenda's explanation. They spoke of founding fathers, harvest festivals, and a strong, resilient community. But in the back, in a section of brittle, leather-bound ledgers containing the town's vital records, I found the first crack in the story. The ledgers recorded every birth, every marriage, every death in Havenwood since its founding in the late 1700s. I started with the most recent and worked my way back. The death records were meticulously kept. Cause of death, next of kin, place of burial, and up until 1923, every single entry for place of burial read Havenwood Cemetery. Then, in the autumn of 1973, they just stopped. The deaths were still recorded, a flu here, a heart attack there, but the place of burial column was left starkly, uniformly blank. From that point on, for nearly 100 years, not a single burial was recorded in the town of Havenwood. I cross-referenced the date with the old bound copies of the Havenwood Valley Chronicle. The issues from the summer of 1923 were full of the usual small-town news. Then, in late September, the tone shifted. There was a small cryptic article on the front page about a virulent, fast-moving sickness that had taken hold in the town. The article was vague, with no mention of symptoms or official diagnoses. The following week's edition was thinner, half its usual size. It mentioned the deaths of several prominent citizens, including the town doctor. And then the newspaper stopped. The next available issue was from the spring of 1924, and it was like reading a paper from a different town. The tone was relentlessly optimistic. There were articles about a new town charter, about the founding of the memorial green on the site of the old cemetery, a place to look forward, not back. There was no mention of the sickness, no list of the dead. The intervening months had been surgically excised from the town's history. The name that kept appearing in the pre-1923 records was Blackwood. The Blackwood family had founded Havenwood. They had owned the iron mine that had been the town's lifeblood for a century. I found a photograph of the family from around 1920. At its center was the patriarch, Hezekiah Blackwood, a man with a severe black beard and eyes that seemed to burn with a cold, fanatical fire. He looked like an Old Testament prophet, a man who would not suffer fools or sinners. The Blackwood iron mine, according to the records, had closed for good in October of 1923. The same month, the burials had stopped. As my investigation deepened, the town's subtle hostility began to coalesce around me. The friendly smiles became fixed and glassy. Conversations would stop when I entered a general store. I'd feel their eyes on my back as I walked down the street. The quiet of the town was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. The phenomena in my cottage began. It started with small things. A book I'd left on the table would be on the floor. The faucet in the bathroom would be dripping, even though I knew I'd turned it off tightly. Then came the whispers, faint, sibilant sounds from the corners of the rooms just on the edge of my hearing. They sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, but they had a cadence, a rhythm, like a hushed, urgent conversation I couldn't quite make out. One night, I woke up from a nightmare I couldn't remember, my body drenched in a cold sweat. The room was freezing. I could see my breath in the moonlight slanting through the window, and in the corner of the room there was a patch of darkness that was blacker than the surrounding shadows. It seemed to pulse, to breathe. As I watched, paralyzed with a primal, pre-verbal terror, a single, pale, skeletal hand emerged from the darkness, reaching towards me, its fingers twitching. I cried out and threw myself back against a headboard, and the darkness and the hand vanished. I was being warned. The message was clear. Stop digging. But I couldn't. The thought of those voices of that child crying for its mother made it impossible to stop. I found an old hand-drawn geological survey map of the valley in the library archives, a map that Mr. Abernathy had seemed reluctant to show me. It confirmed my growing, horrifying suspicion. The Blackwood iron mine was a sprawling network of tunnels, and they ran directly and extensively beneath the perfect green lawn of the Memorial Green. It was a man the locals called Old Man Hemlock who gave me the final, jagged piece of the puzzle. He was a recluse who lived in a shack deep in the woods, a man the town treated as a harmless eccentric. I found him sitting on his porch, carving a piece of wood with a gnarled, steady hand. His eyes, when he looked up at me, were surprisingly clear and sane. "You're the fella asking questions," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," I said, my heart pounding. "Some holes are best left unfilled," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "You hear 'em, don't you? The hungry ones?" "What are they?" I whispered. "What happened here?" He looked out toward the distant green slope of the cemetery. "That ain't a sickness that took this town in 23, he said, his voice dropping even lower. "That was a reckoning. Hezekiah Blackwood, he didn't dig for iron in that hill. He was digging for something else, something older than the hills themselves. He made a pact for prosperity, for longevity, a fountain of youth watered by tears." My blood ran cold. "What kind of pact?" "The kind that demands a price," Hemlock said. "A tithe. The earth gives, but the earth must be fed. The sickness was a lie to cover the first payment. They didn't die, not really. Hezekiah, he and his chosen, they took the sick, the weak, the old, and they put them in the tunnels, alive, an offering to keep the darkness in the ground happy. I stared at him, my mind reeling, trying to process the sheer Lovecraftian horror of his words. This wasn't a mass grave, it was a larder, a subterranean prison farm of human suffering, the impossible vibrant health of the town, its placid calm, its unnatural resistance to the decay of the outside world. It was all being paid for by the screams of the damned. The townspeople, I started. They're the descendants, he finished, for me, the jailers. They live their long, happy lives on top of a symphony of agony, every one of them, and they know the rules. The pact must be honored. The tithe must be paid. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze sharp and piercing. And you hear that bell in the town square? That ain't a church bell. It's rung when one of them is near the end. It's a dinner bell. Lets the hungry ones know a new resident is on the way. Keeps the cycle going. A wave of nausea washed over me. I thought of Brenda's hard, warning eyes, the watchful silence of the town. This wasn't just a secret. It was a religion. A monstrous, secret-draped religion of human sacrifice. I knew then that my time in Havenwood was running out. I was no longer just a curious outsider. I was a threat. I had uncovered the rotten foundational truth of their perfect little town, and they would not, could not, let me leave with that knowledge. My digging had disturbed a quiet order of things, and the pact, I suspected, demanded balance. The realization that I was the new tithe came with the ringing of the bell. I was in my cottage, frantically packing a bag, my hand shaking so badly I could barely zip it. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody, apocalyptic hues. And then it began, a low, resonant bong that echoed through the valley. It was the bell from the town square. Bong. It was a slow, deliberate tolling. It was a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but deep in the bones of the earth. Bong. It wasn't a funeral bell. It was a summons. I looked out the window. In the twilight, I could see figures emerging from the houses down the street. They moved with a slow, calm, inexorable purpose, and they were all walking in my direction. Their faces, what I could see of them, were blank, their friendly masks stripped away to reveal the grim, determined faces of executioners. I fled out the back door and into the woods. The forest, once a place of quiet solace, was now a labyrinth of grasping shadows and menacing shapes. I could hear them behind me, not crashing through the undergrowth, but moving with an unnerving, practiced silence. They knew these woods. This was their hunting ground. My only hope, my only conceivable path of escape, was to circle around a town. But as I ran, the tolling of the bell seemed to guide my pursuers, its resonant waves a form of sonar pinpointing my location. I stumbled out of the woods and onto the road, and my heart sank. I was on the western edge of town. I had run in a circle, and right in front of me, its iron gates gaping open like the maw of some great beast, was the memorial green. They were waiting for me. A semicircle of townspeople stood at the gate, their faces illuminated in the cold white light of a single bare bulb that hung over the entrance. Brenda from the diner was there, the gas station attendant, Mr. Abernathy, the librarian, looking more like a vulture than ever. They weren't holding weapons in the traditional sense. They were holding shovels, ropes, and thick canvas sacks. There was nowhere to run. They advanced on me, their movements slow and ritualistic. I was herded like a sheep to the slaughter, through the gates and onto the perfect emerald grass. The bell continued its slow, hypnotic tolling, and as I was pushed towards the center of the green, the screams from below began to rise, louder and more insistent than ever before, as if in hungry, terrible anticipation. I was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from my lungs. I saw Brenda's face above me, her expression not one of malice, but of a grim, sorrowful necessity. "The pact must be honored," she said, her voice a flat, dead thing. "The valley must be fed." But as they pinned my arms and legs, a different sound cut through the air, a grating, metallic shriek. One of the men was using a heavy iron key to unlock something in the ground. A section of the perfect lawn, I now saw, was not lawn at all. It was a masterfully concealed trapdoor, a sod-covered slab of iron. As they heaved it open, a wave of cold, foul air washed over me, a charnel house stench of damp earth, decay, and profound ancient despair. It was the gateway to hell, and below, in the Stygian darkness, I could see a faint, shifting, phosphorescent glimmer, and I could hear the wet, scrabbling sounds of things moving in that final, desperate moment as they prepared to throw me into the pit. My mind, sharpened by pure terror, found an escape route. It wasn't a route for my body, but for my story, my phone. I had been recording my conversation with Old Man Hemlock, and the phone was still in my pocket, still connected to the cloud. With a final adrenaline-fueled surge, I twisted my body and managed to get a hand into my pocket. My fingers closed around the smooth, cool glass of the phone. I didn't have time to do anything else. As they lifted me, swinging me over the open pit, I hit the live stream button on a social media app I hadn't used in years. I didn't know if I had a signal. I didn't know if it would work. It was a final, desperate message in a bottle, thrown into the digital ocean. The last thing I saw before they let me go was the screen of my phone, flickering to life, the red live icon glowing like a single defiant drop of blood in the darkness. Then I was falling. The fall was short, a jarring impact that sent a bolt of agony through my leg. I landed on a floor of cold, damp, packed earth. The trapdoor slammed shut above me, plunging me into an absolute disorienting blackness. The bell had stopped. The air was thick, suffocating, and filled with the deafening, echoing symphony of the damned. The screams were all around me now, a physical pressure against my eardrums. My phone had survived the fall. Its screen was cracked, but the light from it cut a weak, pathetic beam into the oppressive dark. I scrambled back, pressing myself against a rough stone wall, and held the phone out like a sword. The light illuminated a scene from a madman's fever dream. I was in a wide circular chamber, the central hub of the mine, and from the dozens of tunnels that radiated outwards from the chamber, they were coming. They were no longer human. The decades, the century of being trapped in the living dark, had twisted and reshaped them. They were pale, desiccated things. Their skin stretched thin and translucent over their skeletal frames. Their hair was long and white and wispy, and their fingernails had grown into yellowed, curving talons that scraped against the stone floor. But their eyes were the worst part. They had no pupils, no irises. They were just two faintly glowing milky white orbs that stared at me with an expression of eternal, ravenous agony. They were the hungry ones, and I was the offering. They shuffled towards me, a slow, inexorable tide of living death, their mouths open in silent screams, their clawed hands reaching. My own scream was a raw, ragged tear in my throat. I was going to die here. I was going to be torn apart and consumed, and then I was going to become one of them. My own voice added to the subterranean chorus for all eternity. But as the first one reached me, its glowing eyes inches from my face, its breath a foul, grave-like exhalation, the light from my phone flickered across its face. It flinched. It recoiled from the light, raising a skeletal hand to shield its eyes, and let out a high-pitched, hissing shriek. The light, they were creatures of the absolute dark. The light hurt them. Hope, a wild, impossible thing, flared in my chest. I turned the phone's flashlight function on, and the beam, though weak, was like a searchlight in the Stygian gloom. I swept it across the chamber, and the advancing tide of figures fell back, hissing and shielding their faces, a writhing mass of pale limbs and glowing eyes. It bought me a moment. I scrambled to my feet, my injured leg screaming in protest, and chose a tunnel at random, plunging into the darkness, using my phone as both a light and a shield. The tunnel was narrow, claustrophobic, the walls slick with a damp, foul-smelling slime. I could hear them behind me, their shuffling, scraping pursuit echoing in the confined space. I ran, stumbling, falling, my body a symphony of pain and terror. The tunnel twisted and turned, and every new corner threatened to reveal a dead end. The battery on my phone was at 7%. The light began to flicker, my shield against the encroaching dark growing weaker with every passing second. And then I saw it. Faintly, at the far end of the tunnel, a different kind of light. A small square patch of gray. Air. It was an old ventilation shaft, long forgotten, choked with weeds and roots, but it was a way out. The battery on my phone died. I was plunged back into absolute blackness, and the things behind me surged forward, their hissing growing louder. I ran the last few yards in the dark, my arms outstretched, and threw myself at the square of light. I clawed at the dirt and the roots, my fingers bleeding, and pulled myself up, inch by agonizing inch, into the narrow vertical shaft. I could feel their talons scraping at the heels of my boots, but I kept climbing, pulling myself up towards the sky. I burst out of the ground into the cool, clean air of the deep woods, gasping and sobbing, covered in filth and blood. I was miles from the memorial green, on the far side of the hill. I didn't look back. I just ran until the woods gave way to a highway, and I flagged down the first passing truck, a terrified, babbling madman who had just clawed his way out of his own grave. My live stream had worked. For 17 terrifying minutes, the world had watched a shaky, flickering feed of a man being thrown into a pit and then pursued by impossible creatures through a dark tunnel, his screams mingling with the screams of 100 others. The feed cut out, but it was enough. By the time the state police, spurred on by a viral video that was being called the most elaborate horror hoax ever staged, arrived in Havenwood, the town was empty. The houses were abandoned, as if the residents had simply vanished into thin air. They found a trapdoor in the memorial green. They found the tunnels. They found the bones of those who had crumbled to dust, and they found the others, the ones who still moved. The authorities have sealed the mine, and the official story is a bizarre, convoluted tale of a forgotten, isolated cult. No one wants to believe the truth. I am in a hospital now. They tell me I'm lucky to be alive. They are treating my physical wounds, but they have no cure for the wounds on my soul. My phone was recovered, its data intact. the recording of Old Man Hemlock, the live stream, the photos of the blank perfect cemetery. I have my proof, but it has cost me my sanity. Because sometimes, late at night, in the sterile, quiet dark of my hospital room, I can still hear them. It's faint, just on the edge of my hearing, a muffled, desperate chorus. The screams have followed me, or maybe I've just finally learned to hear the sounds of all the other hidden places in the world, the places built on secrets and suffering. Maybe the whole world is a cemetery with no graves, and I am doomed to be the only one who can hear the screaming. My grandma's old radio plays stations that don't exist. My grandmother, Ilara, was a collector of silent things. Her house, a 2-story Victorian that creaked like a ship at sea, was a museum of objects that had outlived their purpose. Brass barometers that had forgotten the weather, clocks whose hands were frozen in a perpetual state of 10 past 4, and a fleet of beautiful, intricate ships in bottles, their tiny sails forever becalmed. When she passed away at the age of 89, she left me the house and everything in it. I, a sound designer for independent films, a man whose life was a carefully curated collage of noise, inherited a kingdom of profound and unsettling silence. I came to the house not to live, but to sort, to dismantle the quiet, ordered life she had built. For the first week, I was an archaeologist, sifting through layers of dust and memory. The air smelled of lavender, beeswax, and the dry, sweet scent of decaying paper. It was a lonely, melancholic task, a conversation with a ghost who would only speak through the objects she had left behind. I found the radio in the attic, shrouded in a yellowed linen sheet like a piece of holy statuary. It was a magnificent beast, a 1948 Sentinel floor model, its wooden cabinet the color of rich, dark honey, its cloth grill a complex geometric pattern of woven gold thread. A single, large, cyclopean dial made of a milky, amber-colored bakelite dominated the front panel. It was a thing of beauty, a cathedral dedicated to the worship of forgotten broadcasts. I was a man who loved vintage audio equipment, and the sight of it was a balm to my grieving, listless soul. I spent the better part of an afternoon wrestling it down the narrow attic stairs and into the living room, placing it in the corner where a sad-looking fern had finally given up the ghost. I plugged it in. Nothing, not a hum, not a crackle. The silence from the radio was just a more concentrated version of the silence that already filled the house. Of course, I couldn't leave it alone. The next day, I had the back panel off, my tools spread out on a dust sheet. The inside was a miniature city of vacuum tubes, cloth-wrapped wires, and enormous wax paper capacitors. It was surprisingly clean, as if Grandma had been tending to it right up until the end. I found the culprit easily enough. A single, burnt-out rectifier tube. A quick search online. A trip to a specialty electronics store in a town 40 miles away, and a few hours later, I had the new tube in place. I plugged it in again. This time, as I turned the knob, a soft, warm, golden light bloomed behind the dial, and a low, gentle hum filled the room, the sound of a sleeping giant beginning to stir. I turned the large weighted tuning knob, and the needle slid across the frequency band. The speaker crackled, hissed, and then, through a blizzard of static, a voice emerged. It was a man's voice, a classic mid-century announcer's baritone, smooth and full of a folksy, unwarranted confidence. And that's a guaranteed promise from Miller's Hardware in lovely downtown Silver Creek. Remember, folks, For any job, big or small, Miller's has it all. Now, let's get back to the music with Patti Page. A lush, orchestral arrangement swelled from the speaker, the sound rich and warm, full of a nostalgic hiss that no digital filter could ever truly replicate. I smiled. It worked. I leaned back in Grandma's floral armchair, a feeling of deep satisfaction washing over me. It was only after the song had finished and a news report began about a prize-winning pumpkin at the annual town fair that a strange, dissonant thought began to bubble up in my mind. Silver Creek. I knew every town, every forgotten hamlet within 100-mile radius of this house. I had never heard of a Silver Creek. I pulled out my phone and searched for it. Nothing. No Silver Creek, Wisconsin, no Miller's Hardware, no local radio station with the call letters WSC. I checked a list of historical town names. Still nothing. It was a ghost town, a place that had never existed. My rational mind, the part of me that designed soundscapes based on the hard, cold laws of physics, immediately supplied an explanation. A pirate radio station. Some hobbyist out in the woods with a vintage transmitter, broadcasting his own curated nostalgic programming. It was a charming, eccentric explanation, and it satisfied me for a while. But the broadcasts were too perfect, too dense. They weren't just playing old songs. They were broadcasting a whole, fully realized world. There were commercials for businesses that had no online footprint, public service announcements for a school district that didn't exist, a Lonely Hearts call-in show where the residents of this phantom town would share their small, mundane heartbreaks. I would sit for hours listening, a strange, voyeuristic anthropologist studying a lost tribe that had never been found. The first crack in my pirate radio theory came a week later. I was twisting the dial late one night, the golden light of the radio the only illumination in the dark room. I moved past the Silver Creek station and into a howling wilderness of static. And then another signal began to resolve. It was different. The sound quality was cleaner, sharper, and the broadcast was in a language I didn't recognize, a melodic, flowing tongue that sounded vaguely Slavic. It was a woman singing a lullaby, her voice filled with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. Behind her, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of rain against a window pane. The song ended, and a man began to speak, his voice soft and urgent. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was universal. He was pleading. He was afraid. And in the background, another sound began to grow, a low, guttural, and deeply menacing roar, like the sound of a great distant fire. The broadcast was abruptly cut off by a shriek of pure, undiluted static. My heart was pounding. That was not a hobbyist. That was a raw, unfiltered slice of someone's terror. I tried to find the station again, but it was gone, swallowed by the static. The radio was no longer just a charming curiosity. It was a puzzle, a mystery that was beginning to consume me. The stations were not just from one non-existent place. They were from somewhere else, or perhaps from sometime else. I started keeping a logbook, documenting every strange broadcast. I found a station that played nothing but a single, repeating, 5-note musical phrase over and over again for hours on end. I found a station where a man would simply read numbers, his voice a dry, emotionless monotone. I found a station that was just the sound of a ticking clock and a woman weeping softly. The breakthrough, the moment that transformed my obsession into a full-blown, terrifying reality, was a broadcast that sounded At first, completely normal. It was a news report in English, in a familiar modern broadcasting style. And in financial news, shares for tech giant Omnicore surged today after the successful launch of their global atmospheric weather control system, the announcer said. CEO Julian Thorne, accepting the World Science Prize in Geneva, stated that this marks a new era for humanity, an era free from the tyranny of drought, famine, and natural disasters. I stared at the radio, my blood turning to ice. I knew who Julian Thorne was. He was my father, but my father was not the CEO of a tech giant. He was a retired high school biology teacher who spent his days tending to his prize-winning roses in a quiet, suburban town. He had never invented a global weather control system. I had just spoken to him on the phone yesterday. He was complaining about the aphids on his golden celebrations. This wasn't a broadcast from the past. This wasn't a broadcast from another country. This was a broadcast from another now. A parallel reality. A world where my father had made a different choice, had pursued a different life, and had apparently become one of the most important people on earth. I felt a wave of vertigo so profound I had to grip the arms of the chair. The radio wasn't just a receiver of stray signals, it was a window into the infinite branching paths of what could have been. The what-ifs and might-have-beens of the universe were all playing out simultaneously, and this old wooden box in my grandmother's living room was somehow able to tune into them. My investigation turned inward, into the house, into the life of the quiet, enigmatic woman who had raised me. I had always seen my grandmother as a simple woman, a creature of routine and quiet dignity, but now I was seeing her in a new light. She wasn't a collector of silent things. She was a curator of them. She had intentionally created a space of profound quiet in her life, and I now suspected it was to make it easier to hear the whispers from the sentinel. In the bottom drawer of her writing desk, tucked beneath a stack of neatly bundled letters, I found her journal. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with her elegant, spidery script. Most of it was the mundane, day-to-day accounting of a quiet life. But here and there, between notes about her garden and the price of eggs, were entries that made my hair stand on end. March the 12th, 1968. The static is heavy tonight. A storm on the other side. Heard a broadcast from a world where the war never ended. The same songs, but sadder. The announcer's voice was so tired, I pray for their peace. June 4th, 1982. Tuned in to a very clear signal. A world where John is a painter. He sounded so happy. He described the light on the coast, the colors. It was a good broadcast, a kind one. It helps to know that somewhere he found his joy. John was my grandfather. He had died in a car crash in 1981, a struggling accountant who had always dreamed of being an artist. My grandmother had known. She had known all along. This radio was not a passive device. It was her confidant, her oracle, her window into the lives her loved ones might have lived. She had used it to find comfort, to visit the ghosts of choices not made. But then the entries began to grow darker. November 2nd, 1995, a new station. It doesn't feel like the others. It's cold, empty. There's a voice, but it's not speaking. It's just a whisper, a sound like dry static. It makes the milk in the kitchen go sour. It makes the flowers in the vase wilt. I must be careful. Some doors are not meant to be opened. July 20th, 2010. The whispering station is stronger. It seems to know when I am listening. I heard a name in the static today, my name. I have unplugged the sentinel. The silence is a blessing. Some echoes are too hungry. Some worlds are better left unheard. She had been terrified of it, this whispering station, this hungry echo. And for the last decade of her life, she had kept the radio silent, a sleeping dragon she dared not wake. And I, in my ignorant, bumbling grief, had not only woken it, but I had fed it my undivided attention for weeks. I should have stopped. I should have unplugged the radio, hauled it back up to the attic, and buried it under a mountain of forgotten things. But I couldn't. I was addicted. And a part of me, a dark, curious part, needed to find the station she had been so afraid of. I found it a week later. It was high up on the band, in a dead zone that should have been nothing but empty air. It started as a faint, rhythmic clicking like a Geiger counter. Then the whisper began. It was a low, sibilant hiss, a sound that was on the very edge of human hearing. It was the sound of 1,000,000 tiny, broken voices all speaking at once, creating a single, coherent, malevolent wave of sound. It was the audio equivalent of staring into a television screen of pure black and white static, and it was calling my name. Alexex! The sound was a hook that snagged itself in the deepest, most primitive part of my brain. The house changed when that station was on. The air grew cold. I'd see movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker of static in the shape of a man. The lights would flicker in time with a rhythmic clicking. One night, I was on the phone with my father, my real father, the biology teacher, and the whisper began to bleed through the phone line, our conversation dissolving into a sea of hissing static. I was being haunted, not by a ghost, but by a possibility, a corrupted, failed reality, an echo of a world that had gone terribly, cosmically wrong, and it was using the radio as an anchor, a bridge into my world. The journal had one final terrifying entry, written in a shaky, almost illegible hand on the last page. It's a reflection, a shadow. The sentinel doesn't just receive, it transmits. Our choices, our lives, they create the echoes it tunes into. But a strong echo, a hungry one, it can try to reflect back. It can try to overwrite. It wants a world to live in. It wants our world. Do not let it show you what you want to see. The warning came too late. The whispering station began to change. It started to broadcast images into my mind, not memories, but temptations. It showed me a world where my mother's cancer had never returned, a world where my best friend in college hadn't died in that stupid, senseless climbing accident. It showed me a world where Eleanor and I had had the child we had always wanted. It was showing me my own personal, curated heaven. All I had to do, the whisper seemed to promise, was keep listening, keep the channel open, let it in. The entity, which I had come to think of as the static, began to manifest more physically. I woke up one morning to find a thin layer of fine black dust, like iron filings, covering every surface in the living room. The mirrors in the house would no longer show my reflection clearly, but a distorted, wavering version of me, as if I were made of television snow. I was being erased, my reality slowly being overwritten by the static of that dead, hungry world. The climax arrived on a stormy Tuesday night. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed against the windows. The power flickered and then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, save for the single golden glowing eye of the sentinel's dial. The whispering station was on, and it was louder than I had ever heard it before. And then it broadcast the one thing I could not resist. It was Eleanor's voice, not a memory, not an echo. It was her, clear as day, as if she were in the room with me. "Tom," she said, her voice full of a desperate, pleading love. "Tom, I'm here. I'm so lost. It's so cold. But I can see a light. Your light. Just turn the dial a little more. Just bring me into focus. You can bring me home." I knew it was a trick. I knew it was the static, wearing the voice of my dead wife like a mask. But my heart didn't care. The grief, the raw, gaping wound of her absence was a vulnerability it had found and exploited with surgical precision. I reached for the dial, my hand trembling. The whisper in my head was a triumphant, sibilant roar. Yes, let her in, let us in. And then another voice came from the radio, a different one. It was my grandmother, a faint, crackling, distant echo, but it was her. "Don't, my boy," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the storm of static. "That's not her. That's the lie the silence tells. You have to choose the real noise, your noise." I was caught between them, the perfect, beautiful lie of my wife's voice and the faint, fragile truth of my grandmother's warning. I looked around the dark room, at the house that had been my sanctuary and had become my prison. I thought of my own life, the messy, imperfect, painful, and real life I had been so desperate to escape. My grandmother hadn't collected silent things because she was afraid of the world. She had collected them so she could listen, so she could understand the infinite, beautiful, and terrible possibilities of a single human life. She had chosen her reality with all its heartbreak, and now I had to choose mine. I took my hand off the tuning knob. "No," I said, my voice a ragged shout. "You are not her, and this is not my world to give." I turned the dial away from the whispering station, away from the siren song of Eleanor's voice. The static shrieked, a sound of pure, frustrated rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The windows rattled, the floorboards groaned, the light from the radio's dial flared blindingly bright, and then, with a pop and a fizz, it went out. One of the main amplifier tubes had blown. The radio fell silent. The whispering in my head stopped. The feeling of cold, malevolent pressure in the room vanished. I was alone again, in the dark, in the quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet, a clean quiet, a real quiet. The next day, I didn't take the radio to the attic. I left it in its place of honor in the living room. I didn't fix it. I understood now. It was not a toy. It was not an oracle. It was a responsibility. It was a listening post on the shores of infinity. And it required a vigilant and very quiet guardian. I live in my grandmother's house now. The silence no longer feels like an absence. It feels like a presence, the presence of all the other worlds, all the other lives, all the other choices, held at bay by a single, silent, magnificent old radio. I am a sound designer who has come to appreciate the profound, powerful, and sometimes necessary beauty of silence. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear a faint orchestral swell or the distant folksy voice of an announcer talking about the weather in a town that never was. And I smile. I know the echoes are still out there. But I have chosen my station, and I am finally content to listen to the beautiful, heartbreaking, and perfectly real static of my own life, I found a hidden room behind my mirror. Someone was living there. I inherited the apartment from my great-aunt Beatrice, a woman whose life had been a meticulous study in quiet routine right up until the point where she wasn't quiet anymore. It was a pre-war brownstone unit, 3 floors up, with impossibly high ceilings, crown molding that looked like carved icing, and a labyrinthine heating system that hissed and groaned like a sleeping dragon. The whole place smelled faintly of mothballs and old dry paper, and while it was beautiful, it was undeniably old, full of architectural secrets and the kind of strange permanent shadows that modern lighting couldn't seem to dispel. I moved in because the rent was non-existent, and because I, too, enjoyed the quiet routine that the building seemed to enforce. The apartment's master bathroom was particularly strange. It was large and overly ornate for a bathroom, featuring a clawfoot tub and a massive, antique-looking mirror that dominated the entire wall above the pedestal sink. The mirror was huge, framed in dark, heavy carved oak, and it was bolted directly into the plaster. It wasn't the kind of mirror you could simply lift and move. It felt like a fixture, a permanent portal in the room's history. I tried to clean it, but the glass had an inherent subtle distortion, a kind of rippling imperfection that made my reflection seem slightly warped, stretched, or sometimes just out of sync with my movements. I put it down to the age of the glass and the silver backing, but I always felt an unpleasant chill when I stood too close to it, a strange, localized cold spot that lingered no matter how high I cranked the radiator. It was that cold spot that first became a nuisance, and then a horrifying clue. I am a meticulous person, a creature of habit and order, and I hate inefficiency. The draft, or whatever it was wasting my heat. I started my investigation with a thermal gun, the kind used for home energy audits. The plaster wall around the mirror registered a consistent 72 degrees, the room temperature. But the exact center of the mirror, the focal point where my reflection's face usually was, registered a baffling 58 degrees. It was a localized, persistent cold, not a draft, but a chill coming from inside the wall. Intrigued, I tapped the glass. The sound was solid near the edges, a heavy, dull thud of glass against plaster. But as I moved my knuckles toward the cold spot, the thud changed. It became hollower, lighter, an echoing, unsettling tap, tap, tap that suggested a significant, unsupported cavity behind the frame. I ran my hand over the oak frame, feeling for a hinge or a latch, but the thing was bolted down with iron screws that had been painted over and sealed with layers of glossy enamel. I decided I had to see what was back there. It was likely a bricked-up chimney flue, a long-forgotten service shaft, or maybe just a clumsy repair job. I told myself it was for the sake of energy efficiency. It took me 3 hours with a screwdriver, a utility knife, and a lot of swearing to chip away the paint and pry the decorative molding off the mirror's frame. The frame itself was held in place by 4 enormous heavy-gauge bolts sunk deep into the wall. As I loosened the last one, the massive mirror gave a shudder and pitched forward an inch, revealing a shocking amount of dust and grime and a thin, dark line of shadow between the frame and the wall. I slowly, carefully, lowered the mirror onto the bathroom floor, the glass reflecting the ceiling and the frantic, pale image of my own face. What was revealed was not a bricked-up flue, but an archway, It was a small, crudely cut opening in the plaster and lath, roughly the size of a man's torso, almost perfectly centered where the cold spot had been. The edges of the opening were ragged, showing the inner structure of the wall, but there was no plaster dust on the floor below it. That meant the opening had been there for a long time. The biggest shock, however, was what the opening led to. It didn't lead to darkness or a void or the back of a chimney. It led to a space that was clearly a room. I shone the flashlight of my phone into the cavity. It wasn't a standard crawl space. It was a narrow, elongated room, maybe 6 feet wide and 15 feet long, running parallel to the bathroom wall and extending into the dead space between my apartment and the building's main staircase, or maybe another unit. The walls were unfinished brick, and the floor was covered in a layer of old, fine, metallic-smelling dust, the kind that accumulates in forgotten, unventilated spaces. But the dust had been disturbed. There was a clear, swept pathway leading from the opening deeper into the dark. And then I saw the objects. The first thing I registered was a sleeping cot, a simple canvas military-style bed positioned in the furthest corner. It was neatly made, but the pillow was dented, the blanket slightly rumpled, a clear sign of recent use. Next to the cot, there was a makeshift shelf fashioned from a piece of old wood placed atop 2 stacked bricks, and on that shelf a few personal items: a small tarnished silver cup, a worn, paper-covered book that I couldn't make out the title of, and next to the shelf, tucked discreetly against the wall, a 5-gallon plastic bucket, presumably for sanitary purposes. But the detail that locked the horror in my throat, freezing the air in my lungs, was the tray. Placed near the opening, directly facing where the mirror had been, was a small silver-rimmed tea tray. On it sat a ceramic plate with half a tuna salad sandwich, neatly cut and covered with a piece of plastic wrap. It wasn't moldy. The bread hadn't gone stale. It had been left there at most a few hours prior. Someone was living here. Someone had been living here today. I took a step back, the phone slipping in my sweaty hand. The person who lived here was not a vagrant who had broken in. This room was an architectural anomaly, a permanent hidden space accessed through a secret hole in my wall, a hole that was covered by a massive, centuries-old mirror. The occupant had to have known the architecture, had to have a key, or an incredible talent for stealth. Then my eyes snapped back to the opening, and specifically to the inner side of the mirror frame that was now resting on my floor. I ran my fingers over the glass. On the side that had faced the wall where the archway was, there was a patch of clear, pristine glass about the size of a small window pane. The rest of the backing was opaque and silvery, but this one section had been chemically stripped, replaced by a specialized translucent film. It wasn't a mirror on that side at all. It was a cleverly disguised one-way window. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a rush of nausea that made the already close air of the bathroom feel suffocating. I hadn't just been looking at my reflection for the past 2 months. I had been observed. Every morning, shaving, brushing my teeth, staring into the glass, I hadn't been alone. The person inside had been watching me, their cot positioned perfectly so that my face, my routine, the minutiae of my solitary life were their entertainment, their window to the outside world. The slight distortion I had always complained about was the result of the crude one-way film, not the age of the glass. The cold spot was their breathing, their body temperature, their proximity to the pain. I scrambled out of the bathroom, shutting the door and locking it with a desperate, frantic click of the cheap brass bolt. I called the police. When they arrived, they were skeptical. They were thorough, though, and they crawled into the space. They found the cot, the bucket, the shelf. But the sandwich was gone. The plate was empty, wiped clean. The book was closed and pushed further back on the shelf. The police found no fingerprintable surfaces, no documents, no evidence of a crime beyond trespassing. They theorized it was a transient, a squatter who knew the old building's layout, who had been hiding there, and who had fled when I started removing the mirror. They taped off the area, filed a report that mentioned a likely unhoused individual, and left. I knew they didn't believe the part about the one-way mirror, suggesting I was overreacting due to the shock. I didn't replace the mirror. I couldn't. Instead, I boarded up the archway with 2x4s and several layers of drywall, sealing the opening with a thick coat of plaster, the smell of which was meant to replace the metallic dust I had smelled. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the person had fled the building, but the knowledge of the hidden room had irrevocably altered my reality. That's when the sounds began. They weren't coming from the sealed-up mirror room, or at least not only from there. They came from the walls, not the loud, familiar creaks of an old building settling, but soft, dry, insidious noises. A faint, rhythmic scrabbling like fingernails on dusty plaster, or the movement of a tiny animal, but too controlled, too deliberate to be a mouse. A soft, measured thump-tap slide, a sound that seemed to be traveling in the dead spaces between the joists, the service shafts, and the vertical pipes of the ancient heating system. I would be reading in my living room, and the sound would be directly behind the bookcase. I would be in my kitchen, and it would seem to emanate from the space between the cupboard and a wall. I realized the mirror room wasn't the person's only space. It was their observatory. Their home was the entire forgotten, hidden infrastructure of the building, a complex, dark network of architectural dead space that was only accessible to someone impossibly small, flexible, and utterly silent. They were living in the negative space of the brownstone like a parasite in the host's body, and my apartment was merely one visible surface of their sprawling, invisible habitat. The terror became an exquisite, personalized form of psychological torture. My things would be subtly moved. I would leave my wallet on the hall table and later find it pushed half an inch further toward the wall. I'd be certain I'd close the window latch before leaving for work, only to find it slightly ajar when I returned. One evening I reached for my toothbrush and noticed it was distinctly wet when I knew I hadn't used it for hours. These were not the signs of a burglar or a vandal. They were the signs of an intimate observer, someone who had learned my habits so well they could use the briefest moments of my absence to slip out, move freely, and then retreat back into the silent, dusty labyrinth. The ultimate psychological attack came one night when I was asleep. I woke up suddenly with that visceral jolt of someone watching you. The room was black, silent, the kind of absolute darkness that presses down on your eyelids. I held my breath, listening, the frantic hammering of my own heart deafening in my ears. And then I heard it, a soft, dry, almost papery cough that came from the wall directly behind my headboard. It was the cough of a person, but one whose lungs were choked with old dust and the dry air of unventilated space. It was right there. I shot out of bed, slammed on the light, and stared at the beige, innocuous wall. Nothing. No vent, no crack, no seam. Just the solid, painted plaster. I stopped trying to escape the reality. I accepted terrible truth. I was sharing my life with an elegant silent shadow, a forgotten dweller of the city's unseen spaces who used my apartment as a source of warmth and human observation. I went to the sealed-up bathroom. The freshly plastered archway looked solid, but I could hear a faint, high-pitched, scritching sound coming from within the wall. I grabbed a Sharpie and a piece of paper, and I taped the note to the newly painted wall directly over where the one-way mirror had been. The words were a mix of desperation and challenge. Who are you? Please, stop. Why are you here? You need help? The next morning, the note was gone. The tape was still there, a pale frame around nothing. In its place, stuck to the plaster with a tiny, nearly invisible dab of what looked like dried mud, was a small, meticulously folded piece of paper, no bigger than a matchbook. I had to use tweezers to retrieve it. The handwriting was thin, elegant, almost spider-like, a script from a forgotten century, yet completely legible. The message was 3 chilling, impossible words. I am your silent twin. You are too loud. The insult wasn't just in the words. It was in the revelation that my life, my quiet life, was an intolerable racket to this person. My movements, my breathing, the sound of my television, the scraping of my chair, all of it was a cacophony disrupting their perfect, absolute silence. I knew I had to see them. I had to know what kind of human being could exist in such a space. I had to face my silent twin. That night, I waited. I set up my phone on a tripod with the flash off, recording video, and I sat on the floor of the bathroom, a blanket wrapped around me, a heavy wrench lying uselessly beside me. The main lights were off, the only illumination coming from the thin sliver of light beneath the door. Hours passed. The building settled. The heating system finally fell silent. I was a man of routine, and my routine was to sleep. Despite the fear, despite the adrenaline, my body betrayed me. I slumped against the wall, and exhaustion, my old enemy, finally claimed me. I woke with a jolt. The air in the room was suddenly, drastically colder. I hadn't heard a sound. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking, and looked at the time. 3:17 a.m. I had been asleep for maybe 20 minutes. I stared at the sealed archway, expecting to see a fresh hole, but the plaster was intact. The scrabbling sound, however, was back, and it was loud, no longer behind the plaster, but right next to me. I realized the sound was coming from the air vent near the floor, the old cast-iron grill on the baseboard that fed the heating system. I spun around, wrench in hand, and focused the dim light of the phone screen on the vent. It wasn't just a sound. The vent cover was slightly ajar, tilted outward at a small, impossible angle, and from the thin black gap created by that angle, something was moving. It was a person, impossibly thin, dressed in layers of old dusty gray fabric that seemed to blend perfectly with the shadows and the dirty plaster. Their face was a pale, wedge-shaped mask, their hair matted with dust, but their eyes were the thing that held me. They were huge, dinner plate-sized, dilated to absolute blackness, reflecting the pinprick of my phone light like twin black mirrors. They were the eyes of a creature accustomed to near absolute, perpetual darkness, eyes that found my faint illumination blinding. They were not menacing. They were terrified. They froze, seeing me, the light, the weapon. For a single, terrifying second, our lives intersected, the man of the light, the man of the dark. And then, with an impossible fluidity, a speed that defied the limits of the human skeleton, the creature slid backward, not running, but smoothly retreating, pulling their thin, dusty body through the narrow ventilation grill. I heard the sound of dry, brittle bones flexing and the rustle of old cloth. The cast-iron grill, which was heavy and usually required a screwdriver to move, pulled itself shut with a soft, decisive click. I sat there for an hour, the light blazing, the wrench still in my hand, staring at the perfectly closed vent. I knew I couldn't report this. I knew the police would institutionalize me. I knew I was not safe. I moved out the next day. I left the furniture, the keys, everything. I moved to a sleek, modern glass and steel apartment tower, a sterile world of new construction where there are no hidden spaces, no old service shafts, no architectural dead zones for a shadow dweller to hide. I live on the 22nd floor, surrounded by sealed walls and new HVAC systems. But I am not free. Every rhythmic thrum of the building's central air conditioning sends a cold wave of panic through me. Every shadow cast by the city lights at night seems to hold a shape that is impossibly thin. I jump at the sound of the elevator moving in the wall, and 1 month ago, a letter was forwarded to my new address from the old brownstone. It was a standard-sized envelope, the paper smelling faintly of ozone and old metallic dust. Inside, there was a single, meticulously folded piece of paper, the same spider-like script. I miss the quiet routine of your sleep. The new walls are too thin. You are still too loud. My terror is now complete. He is not in the walls of the brownstone anymore. He is not a squatter. He is a predator, or perhaps a shadow twin, and he has been following me. He has learned my quiet routine, and I know that somewhere in the dead space between the insulation, the vents, and the concrete of my new modern high-rise, there is a pair of black, dilated eyes watching me, waiting for me to be still enough, quiet enough, for him to slip out and finally introduce himself. And I know with crushing certainty that I will never be truly alone again. Every night, my neighbor's lights flash in Morse code. Last night, it spelled run. I live in a neighborhood that might as well be called the lull. It's a quiet, meticulously manicured suburban cul-de-sac, where the only excitement is the annual block party and the occasional argument over recycling bin placement. I'm a creature of routine, a tax accountant whose greatest adventure is a weekend hike, and I moved here 3 years ago for the very lack of drama. My house, a 2-story colonial, is separated from my next-door neighbors, a slightly grander Victorian model, by a perfectly adequate 20-foot stretch of lawn and a tall decorative cedar hedge. The hedge is important. It provides privacy, a neat green wall that allowed me to forget they existed. The neighbors, the only people I interacted with on a semi-regular basis, were the Petersons. Or they were the people I assumed were the Petersons. I'd seen a middle-aged couple in the yard a few times, a silver-haired man wearing a sensible cardigan, a woman gardening, but their lives were as invisible to me as mine was to them. They were the epitome of quiet, respectable, suburban anonymity. Then the flickering started. It began subtly about 4 months ago, just after the Petersons had some exterior work done on their house. They had installed a new string of roofline LED lights, the kind that stay on all night for a soft ambient glow. I didn't mind them. They looked festive, even in the middle of a mundane Tuesday. But one night, I was sitting in my living room grading tax forms when I noticed the light on the far corner of their house, the one directly facing my master bedroom window, was behaving strangely. It wasn't a short-circuit flicker. It was a rhythmic flash. A short burst, a long one, another short one, then a pause, and the pattern would repeat. I initially dismissed it as a faulty wire, a cheap Chinese LED that had finally given up the ghost. But the pattern was too clean, too precise. It had a deliberate mechanical cadence that was unsettlingly familiar. I have a strange, almost photographic memory for obscure data. As a teenager, I was briefly obsessed with Babysitter 2 cryptography, spending one summer memorizing the international Morse code chart for a school project that, naturally, no one else cared about. I pulled my laptop closer, pulled up the international Morse code standard, and watched the rhythm again. Short. Long, long, long. Short. It repeated. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The pattern, repeating every 30 seconds, translated perfectly to a single, solitary letter. The letter B. I spent the entire next week watching that light, feeling an obsessive need to decode the message. Every night, exactly at 11 p.m., the light would turn on and begin its silent, rhythmic transmission. B, B, B. It was relentless. I was losing sleep, not because of the light itself, which was faint, but because of the unnerving persistence of the message. I considered walking over there, knocking on the door, and asking the Peterson family about their malfunctioning light. But the fear of sounding completely unhinged, "Excuse me, your faulty LED is sending me a distress signal in outdated naval code," stopped me. I decided I needed more data. The message changed on Friday. I'd been watching for an hour, charting the B's, when the rhythm shifted. The single bulb flashed a short burst, then a long one, then a final short burst. Then a long pause, followed by 3 short bursts. Another pause. A long burst, a short, a long, a short. I typed it into my code chart, my fingers flying across the keys, my breathing shallow and fast. Short, long, short, R. Short, 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 S. Long, short, C. R, S, C. I waited another 30 seconds, watching the light. The pattern repeated, R, S, C, over and over. R, S, C. Was it a name? A radio call sign? It felt like gibberish, an abandoned fragment of a thought. But it was definitely code, and it was being directed at my window. The light was positioned so that anyone inside the Peterson house would have had to manually adjust the fixture to achieve that specific trajectory. The next day, Saturday, I decided to break the routine. I walked over to the Petersons' house, crossed the perfect lawn, and approached the front door. I intended to ask about the light, feign a neighborly concern about their electrical wiring. But as my hand rose to knock, I saw a subtle detail that made me hesitate. The blinds on the front window were not merely drawn. They were taped shut from the inside with black electrician's tape, sealed against the frame so that not a single sliver of light or shadow could escape or enter. The house was not just quiet, it was inert, a crypt of respectable suburbia. I backed away and returned home, the unease now a deep, throbbing ache beneath my ribs. I watched the lights again that night, but with a new awareness. I was no longer an analyst. I was a target. At 11:00 p.m., the light turned on and began its sequence. Long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short. I worked through the sequence on my desk, the numbers and letters blurring under the fluorescent lamp. Long, T. Short, long, short, R. Long, short, long, K. Short, E, T, R, K, E. Not a common word, perhaps a name, perhaps a brand. Then the message repeated, slightly faster this time. T, R, K, E, T, R, K, E, T, R, K, E. The frantic repetition felt like a cry for help. The following night, the message was longer, taking nearly a minute and a half to transmit. I sat in the dark, notebook on my knee, meticulously recording every flash, the frantic dots and dashes turning into a desperate narrative. Long, 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 short, short, long, long, short, 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 long, short, 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 long, short, 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 long, long, short. I transcribed the letters one by one, writing them down without looking at the whole word until the final letter was confirmed. W-H-A-T-S-U-P. The message wasn't frantic or pleading. It was a question. What's up? A casual conversational inquiry directed at me through the silent language of light. The sheer audacity of it, the cold, calculated normalization of this clandestine communication, made my hands shake. I wasn't just observing a faulty light anymore. I was now part of the exchange. Someone inside that silent house knew I was watching, and they were initiating a dialogue. The question wasn't, "Who are you?" or "Are you watching?" It was, "What's up?" They were assuming I was already involved, a partner in this bizarre, covert correspondence. I couldn't sleep. The implication was paralyzing. If they knew I was watching, they must have placed the light, adjusted the direction, and started the conversation specifically for me. I needed to respond, to end this, to force the reality of the situation into the light of day. But how do you talk to a cryptic entity that communicates through light pollution and a dead language? I went into my attic and found an old, powerful camping floodlight I used for power outages. I dragged it to my bedroom, set it on a tripod, and aimed it at the Peterson's corner light fixture. At 10:55 p.m., I sat down, my finger poised over the power button. I had chosen my response carefully. It was simple, direct, and unassailable. At 11:00 p.m., the Peterson light turned on and began its sequence. Short, long, short, R, short, 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 S, long, short, C. The R-S-C from the previous night, the one I had dismissed as gibberish. This time, I realized what it was. It wasn't a name. It was a call sign, a way to establish a two-way channel. I waited for the full sequence to complete, took a deep breath, and began to flash my floodlight back. Long, 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 O. Long, short, long, K. The light I had bought was far too bright for the suburbs, and my OK was a blinding, disruptive burst aimed squarely at their window. I held the light steady on the final long flash of the K and then turned it off, my heart hammering like a drum. For a full minute, the Peterson light continued its RSC sequence, repeating the call sign, seemingly oblivious to my response. I started to think my message hadn't been seen, that my signal had been too crude, too fast. Then, the RSC sequence cut off midway. The light went completely dark for 10 seconds. Then it came back on and began a new, slow, deliberate transmission. Long, 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 short. Long, short, short. Long, short. Short, long, short, long. Long, long. Long, short, long. Short, short, long. Short, short, short. Short, long, short, long. I was transcribing this with a pencil, The lead breaking twice under the pressure, the message was excruciatingly long, taking nearly 3 minutes to complete. The decoded message was a terrifying, almost poetic answer to my question, FINDRAWERTOOTHHIDDEN. A set of instructions, a frantic coded call to action. I realized the message was so long, so complex, that it had to have been pre-scripted, written down and memorized, a sign that the entity on the other side of the hedge was not in a state of spontaneous panic, but a state of controlled, prolonged distress. I was now neck-deep in a genuine conspiracy. I couldn't go to the police with this. My neighbor is sending me a cryptic message about a tooth drawer in Morse code. I would be institutionalized before I finished the sentence. I had to find the drawer. I went back through the memory of my life with the Petersons. I knew they were in their late 60s. I remembered seeing the woman, the gardener, a few times. I remembered noticing about a year ago a silver SUV parked in their driveway with a logo on the side, a small stylized tooth. Mrs. Peterson was a retired or semi-retired dentist. The message was not about a kitchen drawer. It was about a dental cabinet. I spent the entire next day paralyzed, alternating between calling the police and researching breaking and entering laws. I settled on a coward's compromise. I would leave a message asking for clarification. That night, 11 p.m., the Peterson light turned on. RSC. RSC. I waited for the pattern to complete and then aimed my floodlight at their house and began my counter-transmission. Short, short, long, long. Short, long, short, long. Short, long, short, short, short. PETERSON. I flashed the name, my hands shaking with the audacity of it, naming the owners of the house in a silent, accusatory shriek of light. I watched their window, waiting for the flicker to stop, for the lights to come on in the house, for a terrified face to appear in the window. The light stopped. For another agonizing minute, the entire house was silent and dark. Then the light turned back on and began a new, incredibly slow sequence. The pauses between the dots and dashes were so long that I almost missed the connection between them, as if the sender was physically exhausted or terrified of being caught. Short, long, short. Short, long, long. Long, short, short. Long, short, long, long. Short, long, short, long, long, short. Short. I transcribed it. REALLY. The message was not one of fear or denial. It was mocking, a cold, sardonic rebuke. They weren't just communicating with me. They were playing with me, toying with my escalating anxiety. The realization turned my fear into a cold, hard resolve. I was not dealing with a frightened neighbor. I was dealing with something calculating, perhaps even malicious. I flashed a final message, YES, WHERE. The Peterson house responded instantly. The light flashed a sequence that was only 3 letters long, repeated 3 times, as fast as a machine gun. Long, short, long, long, short, long, short, long, short, short, long. CAVE. Long, short, long, long, short, long, short, long, short, short, long. CAVE. Long, short, long, long, short, long, short, long, short, short, long. CAVE. The message was complete cave. Not a place inside their house, a place outside, a hidden space. The only cave in their yard was the small stone-lined shed they used to store their gardening tools. I couldn't wait until the next night. I waited an hour until 1:00 a.m., the hour of the dead. I slipped on dark clothing, grabbed my large flashlight and the bronze sculpture I used as a paperweight, and climbed over the cedar hedge. The Peterson house was utterly silent, radiating a deep, cold stillness that felt like a permanent vacuum. I crept across the lawn and approached the garden shed. The door was unlocked, a simple latch, which was odd for a secure suburban property. I slid the door open. The air inside was thick and damp, smelling of old peat moss and fertilizer. The shed was full of gardening tools neatly hung on pegs. There was no hidden door, no passage, no tooth drawer, nothing that said cave. I turned to leave, the fear starting to turn into self-loathing for having been drawn into this insane game, when the floodlight I had aimed at the house earlier clicked on, aimed directly at me. I threw my hands up, blinded by the sudden massive burst of white light. The light didn't stay steady. It began to flash. Short, long, short. R. Long, short, long, long. U. Short, long. N. R. U. N. The most primal, terrifying message, a simple, one-word command delivered by a blindingly bright floodlight. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted out of the shed, across the lawn, and scrambled back over the cedar hedge, throwing myself onto my own side of the property. I lay there, panting, the smell of cut grass filling my nostrils, listening. I heard a small, distinctive click from the Peterson house, the sound of the floodlight turning off. I stayed on my side of the lawn, clutching the bronze sculpture, watching the house. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. The house was once again dark, silent, and entirely inert. I waited until morning, then packed a bag, left a note for my cleaning lady, and drove 300 miles to a remote cabin I owned in the mountains. I did not call the police. I knew the Petersons were involved, that they had set the light, but the nature of the message, R-U-N, suggested they were either a prisoner or a deeply disturbed tormentor. I wasn't going to stick around to find out which. I have been in the cabin for 3 weeks now. No internet, no television, no phone signal, just the trees, the snow, and the quiet. I was finally starting to decompress, to allow the impossible events to fade into a nightmare. Then, 3 nights ago, the blizzard hit. It's a whiteout, complete silence, nothing but the wind and the falling snow. I was sitting by the fireplace reading when I saw a faint rhythmic glow outside the window. I dismissed it as the flicker of the firelight reflecting on the window pane, but the rhythm was wrong. It was too sharp, too precise. I walked to the window and looked out into the impossible, swirling white void. The only thing visible was the thick, dark trunk of a massive pine tree, about 50 feet from my front porch, and from behind that tree, a single, incredibly bright point of light was flashing, steady and relentless, cutting through the snow. Short, short, long, long. U, long, short, long, long. R, short, short, short. S, short, long, short, short. T, long, long, long. O, short, long, short, short. D, I transcribed letters on the condensation of the window. U-R-S-T-O-D. It was an anagram, a twisted, scrambled arrangement of a single word. I stared at the letters, my mind racing, cycling through possibilities. Trusted, outsider, Dustero. Then the light behind the tree flashed one last single slow dot, a period, a final punctuation. The light went out. The forest was dark, silent, and only the sound of the wind remained. But the light had left its message. It was a perfect 6-letter word, D-O-T-S. I was staring at the letters I'd written on the glass. Then I looked back at the light. The letters I had seen were U-R-S-T-O-D, and the light had ended with a single dot. A dot in Morse code is an E. I was missing one letter. My memory, my perfect cryptographic memory, had failed me. I had missed a dot or a dash somewhere in the frantic transmission. The light had seen my confusion and sent me a clue. Dots, the components of the language itself. I realized I hadn't made a mistake in transcription. The light had lied to me, given me a false letter, and then sent the correct, final letter as a clue. It wasn't a neighbor anymore. It was a cryptographer, a cold, calculating mind that was playing a game of escalating terror. The true word, the one that used all the letters I had transcribed plus the final one.e, was not an anagram. It was a sentence composed of the letters I saw plus the final E, T, R, U, S, T, E, D. I looked at the light, the final message, the single terrifying dot that was the period, and I knew what had happened. Someone, an intelligence, had followed me, setting up the same exact light system in the woods. And they weren't sending me a warning. They were confirming a truth. The truth was that I was trusted. I was the new recipient of the communication, the replacement for whoever had been taken from that silent house. I was the new antenna, the final complete message, the one that the single dot had been hinting at all along, was the most terrifying realization of all. The letters were not meant to be anagrammed. They were a simple, phonetic, taunting message, a full word that had been split into two coded transmissions, and the final punctuation mark was the only letter I needed. U-R-S-T-O-D-E. You are stood. I am stood here, looking out at the dark woods, knowing the light is gone, but the message has been delivered. I am stood, I am stopped, and I am watched. And the silent, patient intelligence that communicates in dots and dashes is somewhere in the absolute blackness of the forest, waiting for the next exchange to begin, waiting for me to turn on my own floodlight and ask the inevitable question, what's up? I know that the next message will not be a command to run. It will be a set of instructions. And I am terrified because I know that I will not be able to stop myself from answering. The babysitter I hired doesn't exist, but she still sends me pictures. It began with a lie, though at the time I thought it was a lifeline. The lie was a website called sittersafe.com with its calming blue and white color scheme, its stock photos of happy, racially diverse families, and its promise of peace of mind for working parents. I was the target demographic, distilled to my purest, most desperate form. A single father, recently widowed, working a job that demanded more of me than I had to give. My daughter Maya was 6 years old, a tiny, fierce creature with her mother's wide, curious eyes and a spirit that deserved more than a tired, grieving father fumbling his way through each day. Her name on the website was Clara Bell. Her profile was a masterpiece of curated trustworthiness. The photo showed a young woman in her mid-20s with a kind, open face, a sprinkle of freckles across her nose, and warm, intelligent eyes. She was wearing a sensible cardigan. Her bio was pitch perfect, a child development major, certified in CPR and first aid, with a passion for creative play and a list of glowing 5-star reviews that seemed almost too good to be true. Clara was a gift, one review gushed. Our little Alfie is usually so shy, but he took to her immediately. Professional, punctual, and so wonderful with our kids. Another read, she even tidied the kitchen, a true gem. I did my due diligence. I paid the extra fee for the premium background check, which came back spotless. We had a video call, and she was just as she appeared in her photo, charming, articulate, and genuinely interested in Maya's love for dinosaurs and sparkly glue. She asked all the right questions. I felt the tight, persistent knot of anxiety in my chest loosen for the first time in months. I hired her for the following Friday night. I had a crucial dinner meeting with a client I couldn't miss. It was the first time I would be leaving Maya with someone other than her grandmother since Sarah had passed. That Friday, she arrived exactly on time. In person, she was even more disarmingly normal. She had a gentle voice and a calm, centered presence that immediately put Maya at ease. She'd brought a tote bag with a new coloring book and a set of crayons that had a glittery sheen. When I left, Maya was sitting at the kitchen table with her, chattering away, already fully under her spell. I drove to my meeting feeling a profound, almost dizzying sense of relief. The first picture arrived at 7:45 p.m. It was a photo of Maya holding up a drawing of a lopsided purple T-Rex. She was beaming, a gap-toothed smile of pure, unadulterated joy. The caption read, "The fearsome Mayasaurus, having a great time." More pictures followed throughout the evening. A shot of Maya in her pajamas, listening intently as Clara read a storybook. A blurry action shot of them building a pillow fort in the living room. Each photo was a little balm to my worried soul, a digital reassurance that I had made the right choice, that my daughter was safe and happy. The last picture came at 9:30 p.m. It was a photo of Maya fast asleep in her bed, her favorite stuffed sloth, Mr. Higgins, tucked under her arm. The soft glow of her rocket ship nightlight cast a warm, peaceful aura over the scene. Safe and sound. Good night from us. When I got home around 11, the house was silent and immaculate. The pillow fort was gone, the toys were back in their chest, and the kitchen was cleaner than I'd left it. I crept into Maya's room and saw the exact scene from the photograph. A perfect tableau of sleeping innocence. I felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost brought me to tears. Clara became our regular babysitter. Every week or two I'd book her, and every time it was the same flawless experience. And the pictures became our ritual. They were my window into their evenings, a steady stream of happy, reassuring moments. They were proof that I wasn't failing my daughter, that even in my absence, her life could be filled with fun and care. The first discordant note, the first tiny crack in the perfect facade, occurred about 2 months in. It was a Tuesday night. I was working from home, trying to meet a deadline. Maya was asleep upstairs. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a picture message from Clara's number. I opened it. It was a photo of Maya, asleep in her bed, clutching Mr. Higgins, bathed in the glow of her nightlight. It was an almost identical replica of the picture she sent on her first night. The caption read, "So peaceful when she sleeps." I stared at the photo, a cold, confusing prickle of unease running down my spine. It was a Tuesday. Clara wasn't here. She wasn't scheduled to be. I was the only other person in the house. I checked the timestamp. The photo had been sent just seconds ago. My first instinct was rationalization. It must be a glitch, a delayed message from her last visit. But the caption felt immediate. I stood up, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I walked quietly up the stairs, my every sense on high alert. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I pushed open Maya's door. She was there, in her bed, exactly as she was in the photo, fast asleep. I backed out of the room, my skin crawling. I texted Clara back. "Strange question, but did you just send me a photo?" The reply was instantaneous. Yes, just thinking about what a sweet girl she is. Hope you both are having a good week. It was a plausible, if slightly odd, explanation. Maybe she was looking through old photos on her phone and sent one by mistake, then tried to play it off. It was weird, but not impossible. I tried to dismiss it, but the image of that photo, sent from outside my house, depicting a real-time event happening within it, was a splinter in my mind that I couldn't quite remove. The following week, I needed to book her again. I logged on to sittersafe.com and searched for her. Profile, nothing. I tried different search parameters. Still nothing. A profile not found error message appeared on the screen. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I went to our old messages on the site's platform. The conversation thread was there, but when I clicked on her name, the same error message popped up. Her profile had vanished. I pulled out my phone and called her number. A generic synthesized voice responded, "The number you have dialed has been disconnected." Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into my veins. This made no sense. I contacted SitterSafe's customer support. I spent 20 minutes on hold listening to a tinny looping piece of instrumental music that frayed my already raw nerves. Finally, a bored-sounding man named Kevin answered. I explained the situation, gave him Clara Bell's name. He put me on hold again. When he came back, his voice was different, cautious. "Sir, we've checked our records. We have no history of a sitter named Clara Bell ever having a profile on our platform." "That's impossible," I said, my voice rising. "I hired her through your site. I have the messages. I paid for a background check." "We have a record of your payments, sir," Kevin said slowly. "But they were for background checks on 3 other potential sitters, all of whom you declined to hire. There's no record of you ever even viewing a profile for a Clara Bell, let alone hiring her." My blood ran cold. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. I was in a nightmare. A woman had been in my house. She had been alone with my daughter. And according to the very service that had supposedly vetted her, she didn't exist. My first overwhelming impulse was to protect Maya. I changed every lock in the house. I bought a state-of-the-art security system with cameras covering every entrance, every angle. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilant terror, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, my phone clutched in my hand like a talisman. The pictures stopped. For 3 weeks, there was silence. I started to breathe again. I told myself it was some elaborate, terrifying scam, a phantom hacker who had created a ghost profile to get my credit card information. I told myself the danger had passed. Then the pictures started again. It was a Monday morning. I had just dropped Maya off at school. As I was pulling away from the curb, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. The picture was of Maya on the school playground. She was on the swings, her head thrown back in laughter. It was a beautiful, candid shot, except for the angle. It was taken from high up, as if from the roof of the school, a place no one should have been. And the photo was unnervingly intimate, a stolen moment of pure joy. Beneath it, a single line of text. "She has your laugh." I almost crashed the car. My vision tunneled. My lungs felt like they were collapsing. It wasn't a scam. It wasn't over. Whoever or whatever Clara was, she was still watching us. The pictures became more frequent, more invasive. A photo of me at my desk, taken through the window of my home office, a picture of our grocery cart at the supermarket, the contents a perfect reflection of our weekly shopping list, a picture of my car parked outside my office. The photographer was everywhere and nowhere. The police were useless. I went to him, my phone in my hand, a wild-eyed, sleep-deprived man trying to explain that he was being stalked by a ghost. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They took a report, but without a suspect, without a crime beyond sending unsolicited photos, there was nothing they could do. They suggested I block the numbers. I did. She just used new ones. Maya started talking about her. She didn't call her Clara. She called her the picture lady. The picture lady was watching me play today, she said one evening, pushing her peas around her plate. What do you mean, sweetie? I asked, my voice tight. At the park. She was hiding behind a big tree. She waved at me. What did she look like, Maya? She was blurry, Maya said, frowning, like a picture that's all fuzzy. And she smells like old books, like Mommy's old books in the attic. The attic, my wife's collection of antique photography books. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. The next day, after dropping Maya at her grandmother's, I tore the attic apart. In the back, under a dusty canvas sheet, was a heavy wooden trunk I hadn't opened since Sarah died. It was filled with her prized possessions, old cameras, development equipment, and stacks of antique photographs and glass plate negatives she had bought at estate sales. I spent hours sifting through them, my heart pounding with a nameless dread. I was looking for a face, the kind, freckled face from the CitiSafe profile. I didn't find it, but I found something else. It was a series of family portraits from the late 1800s, all from the same estate. The family was stern-faced and severe, posing stiffly for the camera, and in the background of several of the photos, slightly out of focus, was a young woman in a nanny's uniform. Her features were indistinct, but there was a certain posture, a certain tilt of the head that made my skin crawl. In the final photograph of the series, a picture of two small children playing with wooden hoops. The nanny was in the background, standing by a window, and she was staring directly at this camera. Her face was a pale oval blur, but her eyes were clear, sharp, and filled with a possessive, unsettling intensity. At the bottom of the trunk, I found an old, leather-bound ledger from the estate. It was a record of household staff. My finger traced down the list of names until it stopped. 1888, 1891. Governess, Clara Bell. The entry was followed by a single, spidery notation. Dismissed. Unwholesome attachment to the children. I felt like I was going to be sick. This wasn't a stalker. This was something else entirely, something ancient and impossible. A ghost who had imprinted herself onto these photographs, who had lain dormant in my attic for years. Had our grief, our loneliness, somehow woken her up? Had my desperate search for a caregiver on the internet provided her with a new medium, a new way to manifest? The pictures changed. They were no longer just of our present. One morning, I received a photo of me as a child, playing in the front yard of my childhood home, a home that was 1,000 miles away, a home my parents had sold 20 years ago. It was a real photograph, one I recognized from an old family album, but it was altered. Standing in the background, partially obscured by a tree, was the faint, translucent figure of a woman in a long, dark dress. She was inserting herself into my past. She was rewriting my history, weaving her ghostly presence into the very fabric of my life. The final straw came last night. My phone buzzed on my nightstand. I've become conditioned to the sound, reacting to it with a Pavlovian jolt of fear. I knew what it would be, but I was compelled to look. The picture that loaded on my screen was not from the past. It was not of the present. It was of a future I couldn't comprehend. It was a family portrait. I was in it, standing beside an older, grayer version of myself. Maya was there too, a young woman now, with the same sad, vacant expression as the man who was her father. We both looked pale, drained, like faded copies of ourselves, and standing between us, her arms wrapped around both of our shoulders in a gesture of maternal possession, was Clara Bell. Her face was perfectly clear, no longer a blur, no longer a photo on a website. She was solid, real, and she was smiling, a wide, triumphant, terrifying smile. She wasn't just watching us anymore. She was joining us. She was feeding on our lives, our memories, our very vitality. The caption beneath the photo was the most chilling of all. Soon we'll all be together, a perfect family, forever. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. I've packed a bag. Maya and I are leaving. We're going to drive until we run out of road. I'm going to throw my phone into a river. I'm going to get a new one, a new number, a new life. But I know it won't matter. She's not tied to a place, not anymore. She's not just a ghost in the attic or a phantom on the internet. She's attached to us. She's a virus in our lives, and she's been sending me snapshots of our own destruction. I look at my beautiful sleeping daughter, and I know I have to try. I have to run, but I fear with a certainty that chills me to the bone that no matter where we go, her pictures will follow. And one day, I'll receive that final faded photograph, not as a warning, but as a welcome home. The winter I turned 34 was the winter the world went silent. It was a silence born of absence, a profound sound-dampening void left by departure of my wife, Amelia. She hadn't died. She had just left, a quiet, bloodless coup, leaving me the sole deposed monarch of our small two-story suburban kingdom. The silence she left behind was a physical entity. It soaked into the drywall, it pooled in the corners of the rooms, and it muffled the outside world, turning cheerful shouts of neighborhood children into distant, tinny echoes. My name is Samuel. I'm a cartographer, a man who makes his living drawing lines creating order from the chaos of geography. My work is precise, logical, and quiet. I had always thought I enjoyed the quiet. I was wrong. The quiet of our house, once a peaceful harbor, was now the vast, terrifying, and empty ocean. I was adrift. The neighborhood, Havenwood Hills, was a perfect self-contained diorama of suburban bliss. Mature oak trees, manicured lawns, and a prevailing sense of polite, unspoken conformity. It was a place where things were supposed to make sense, a place for summer barbecues, for autumn leaf raking, for the gentle, predictable rhythms of a life well lived. It was not a place for an ice cream truck in the dead of winter. The first time I saw it, it was a Tuesday in the bleak, iron-gray heart of January. A thick, wet snow was falling, the kind that clings to every branch and wire, swaddling the world in a thick white bandage. I was in my study, a room on the second floor that overlooked the gentle curve of our street, trying to lose myself in the intricate topography of a coastal estuary map. And then I heard it. It was a melody, a faint, tinny, music box jingle that was so profoundly out of place in the muffled, snowy silence that my mind initially refused to process it. It was "Pop Goes the Weasel." But it was wrong. It was slow, lugubrious, each note slightly off-key, as if the music box that was playing it was very old and very, very tired. The sound grew slowly, agonizingly, louder. I went to the window, my brow furrowed in confusion. And there it was, creeping down the center of the snow-covered street at a pace that was more funereal than festive, was an ice cream truck. It was a relic, a ghost from a bygone era, a vintage 1960s model with rounded, friendly-looking fenders and a high, curved roof. The paint was peeling in long pastel strips of what had once been cheerful pink and white, revealing a layer of rust that was the color of old, dried blood. On the side, in a faded, looping, and vaguely sinister script, were the words, "Jolly Jack's Joyful Gems." The cartoon caricature of Jolly Jack was the stuff of nightmares, a winking, ruddy-cheeked clown whose smile was too wide, whose eyes were just two black, empty circles. The truck moved with a strange, unnatural silence, the only sound the slow, melancholy dirge of its song. It left no tracks in the fresh snow. My first thought was that it was a prank, some art school prankster with a vintage truck and a twisted sense of humor. But as it drew nearer, I saw the other residents of Havenwood Hills begin to emerge from their warm, bright houses. They moved with a slow, shambling gait, their faces slack, their eyes empty and unfocused. They were dressed in their indoor clothes, pajamas, bathrobes, slippers, oblivious to the biting cold and the falling snow. They were like sleepwalkers, drawn from their homes by the truck's sad, hypnotic song. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a man who wouldn't step outside without his tweed jacket, was standing in his driveway in a thin silk dressing gown, a light dusting of snow already gathering on his bald head. The truck stopped directly in front of my house. A small sliding window on its side opened with a soft, scraping sound. A figure leaned out. It was a silhouette, a shape in the deep, shadowy interior of the truck. I couldn't make out a face, just the impression of a tall, thin man in an old-fashioned soda jerk hat. A single, pale, long-fingered hand rested on the counter. The neighbors formed a silent, orderly queue. One by one they would step up to the window, murmur something, and the pale hand would dispense not an ice cream cone, but a small white paper-wrapped block. They would hand over no money. They would simply take the block, turn, and shuffle back to their houses, their faces still wearing the same blank, vacant expression. I watched, my own face pressed against the cold glass of the window, until the last neighbor had been served. The sliding window scraped shut. The slow, sad music began its funereal march once more, and the truck continued its crawl down the street, disappearing into the swirling snow, leaving the pristine, trackless white street behind it. The next day, I tried to talk to Mr. Henderson as he was collecting his mail. "Did you see that ice cream truck yesterday?" I asked, my voice a little too loud, a little too eager. He looked at me. His eyes, which were usually so full of a wry, intelligent humor, seemed clouded, distant. "Truck?" he said, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "I don't think so, son. Not in this weather." He turned and walked back to his house, leaving me standing in the cold, the seeds of a profound and terrible dread beginning to sprout in my gut. The truck returned the next day, at the same time, in the twilight hour as the world turned from gray to black, and the next. It became a part of the winter landscape, a daily, impossible ritual. And every day my neighbors would perform their silent, somnambulistic pilgrimage. After a week of this, I began to notice a change in the neighborhood, a subtle, creeping decay. The Christmas lights, which had been left up in a cheerful, defiant stand against the winter gloom, were no longer being turned on. The lawns, once so meticulously kept, were becoming shaggy and unkempt beneath. The snow, the people themselves, seemed faded. Their smiles were a little more forced, their greetings a little more hollow. It was as if the color, the life, the very soul of Havenwood Hills was being slowly, methodically leached away. My journalistic instincts, a holdover from a brief pre-cartography career, took over. My fear was being eclipsed by a desperate need to understand. I began to research. I dug into the town's archives, sifting through microfiches of old newspapers, my eyes burning from the strain. I found him in an article from the summer of 1974. His name was Jack. Not Jolly Jack. Just Jack. He had been a beloved local figure, the original owner and driver of Jolly Jack's Joyful Gems. There was a picture of him, a kind-faced man with a sad smile, leaning out of the window of his brand-new ice cream truck. And then a second article from the winter of that same year, a tragedy. Jack's 8-year-old son, Bobby, had wandered off during a snowstorm and had never been found. He had been playing in the woods at the edge of the neighborhood and had simply vanished. The town had searched for weeks, but the snow had been too deep. They found nothing. Jack, the article said, was consumed by his grief. He had continued to drive his truck through the neighborhood day after day, long after the season had ended, his cheerful jingle becoming a familiar sad refrain in the winter quiet. He was looking for his son. He was hoping the familiar sound would guide him home. He had driven that route every day until his own death of what the paper called a broken heart a decade later. The truck, his rolling musical tombstone, had been sold for scrap, or so the article said. The knowledge was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. The truck was not a prank. It was a ghost. It was the physical manifestation of a father's eternal, inconsolable grief, doomed to forever patrol the streets where his son was lost. And the driver was the ghost of a man who had never been able to say goodbye. But what was he selling? What were those little white blocks? I knew I had to get closer. The next evening, as the first sad notes of "Pop Goes the Weasel" drifted through the falling snow, I put on my coat and went outside. The cold was a physical shock, a sharp, clean slap in the face. I joined the silent, shuffling line of my neighbors. Standing among them was like standing in a graveyard. Their eyes were vacant, their breathing shallow. The air around them felt thin, depleted. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the window. The inside of the truck was a deep, impossible darkness, and the cold that emanated from it was not the cold of winter, but the deep, cellular, ancient cold of the grave. The pale, long-fingered hand of the driver rested on the counter. His face was a blur of shadow beneath his hat. "What would you like?" a voice whispered. It was not a real voice. It was a dry, rasping sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement. I looked at the menu, a small hand-painted board inside the truck. The flavors were not chocolate or vanilla or strawberry. They were written in the same looping, faded script as the side of the truck. And they were a carefree summer afternoon, the pride of a first success, Christmas morning, age 6, a mother's embrace. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. This was not ice cream. This was something else. What are they? I whispered, my voice trembling. Memories, the driver rasped. Just a little taste to help you forget the cold. My eyes scanned the list again, and my heart stopped. At the bottom of the board, one flavor was written in a slightly different, more recent hand. Amelia's laugh, a sound, a memory, a feeling that I had been chasing in my dreams for 6 agonizing months. The sound that had been the anchor of my life, the thought of hearing it again, of feeling the warmth of it, was a siren song so powerful, so seductive, that it drowned out all the alarm bells that were screaming in my head. I'll have that one, I said, my voice a choked, desperate thing. The pale hand disappeared into the darkness and reemerged with one of the small paper-wrapped blocks. As I reached for it, his cold, dry fingers brushed against my own. It felt like touching a statue. I took the block. It was cold, but it wasn't the cold of ice. It was the cold of absence. I turned and walked back to my house, the small white block clutched in my hand. I felt the empty eyes of my neighbors on my back. I knew I had just crossed a threshold, that I had become a part of their silent, waking nightmare. Inside my house, I unwrapped the block. It was not ice cream. It was a smooth, white, almost translucent substance, like solidified moonlight. It had no smell. I sat in my armchair, the one Amelia had always loved, and I took a small, hesitant bite. The world dissolved. It was not a taste. It was a total sensory immersion. I was no longer in my silent, winter-bound house. I was in our old, sun-drenched garden, in the heart of a perfect July afternoon. I could feel the warmth of the sun on my skin. I could smell the rich, loamy scent of the earth, the sweet perfume of the roses Amelia had planted, and I could hear her. She was laughing, a full-throated, joyous sound that was more beautiful than any music I'd ever heard. She was holding a watering can, a single perfect drop of water clinging to the tip of her nose. The memory was not a memory. It was real. It was perfect. I was there. The experience lasted for what felt like an eternity, and for what was probably only 30 seconds. When it faded, and I was back in my cold, silent living room, the afterglow was so powerful, so euphoric, that I was weeping with a joy so profound it was almost painful. The little white block in my hand was almost gone, melted away into nothing. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced, and it was the beginning of my end. The next morning, I woke up feeling a strange, hollow sensation. The euphoria of the memory was gone, replaced by a gray, aching void. I went to make coffee, and I found myself staring at the coffee maker, a simple drip machine we had owned for years, and I couldn't remember how to use it. The knowledge was just gone. A small, simple, and utterly mundane memory erased. I stood there for a long time, a new, different kind of cold seeping into my bones. The price. The transaction had not been free. I had bought a taste of a perfect memory, and the price had been one of my own. I knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, what was happening to my neighbors. They were trading their lives piece by piece, memory by mundane memory, for the euphoric, nostalgic poison of the ice cream truck. They were hollowing themselves out, becoming empty, silent vessels, their pasts consumed, leaving only the blank, placid present. I should have stopped. I should have thrown the rest of the block away and boarded up my windows and never gone outside again. But I was an addict, and the grief for Amelia was a disease for which that little white block was the only cure. I went back the next night, and the next. I traded the memory of my first grade teacher's name for the feeling of Amelia's hand in mine on our first date. I traded the memory of how to tie a Windsor knot for the smell of her hair on our wedding day. I was systematically dismantling my own history, one cherished, perfect, and utterly false memory at a time. My own life was becoming a blur, a collection of disconnected moments, and the only things that felt real were the ones I was buying from the ghost in the truck. My world grew smaller. I stopped working. The lines on my maps became meaningless squiggles. The only geography that mattered was the 20-yard stretch of frozen lawn between my front door and the curb. It was my neighbor's little girl, a bright 7-year-old named Chloe, who finally broke through my self-induced haze. I saw her from my window, standing in her own yard, building a snowman, and I was struck by a sudden, jarring thought. She was the only child I ever saw outside anymore. The other children of Havenwood Hills were gone, or at least they were no longer visible. And then I saw the truck beginning its slow daily crawl down the street. And I saw Chloe's mother come out of the house, her face wearing the same slack, empty expression as all the others. She took Chloe by the hand and began to lead her towards the street, towards the truck. A primal, protective instinct, an instinct I thought had been eroded away with all my other memories, roared to life inside me. The truck didn't just take memories from the past, it was taking the future too. It was taking the children. I ran out of my house, not even stopping to put on a coat, my bare feet burning on the frozen snow. "No!" I screamed, my voice a raw, ragged thing. "Stay away from her!" Chloe's mother didn't even look at me. She just continued her slow, inexorable march towards the siren song of the truck. But the driver, the shadowy figure of Jolly Jack, turned his head, and for the first time I felt his full, focused attention on me. It was a wave of pure, glacial cold, a malevolent, possessive hatred. He was not just a sad, grieving ghost. He was a predator, and I was interfering with his hunt. I knew I had to stop him, not just for Chloe, but for the entire hollowed-out, silent town. But how do you fight a ghost? How do you kill a memory? The answer, I realized, was in the transaction itself. The truck traded in nostalgia, in the beautiful, edited, perfect versions of the past. It fed on the sweet, saccharine gloss of memory. It had never occurred to me to ask for anything else. That night, I was the first in line. The truck pulled up, its sad song cutting through the frigid air. The window scraped open. The pale hand rested on the counter. "What would you like?" the dead leaf voice whispered. I looked the shadowy figure in the eye. "I want a new flavor," I said, my own voice steady, resonant with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. The figure was still. The hand did not move. "I want the memory of the night Bobby was lost," I said, the words hanging like icicles in the cold air. "I want to taste the fear, the cold, the grief, the real, ugly, unedited truth of it, not the sad story. I want the moment itself." The shadowy figure recoiled, as if struck. A low, guttural moan, a sound of pure agony, emanated from the dark interior of the truck. The pale hand twitched, spasmed on the counter. The truck fed on nostalgia, on the comfort of a lie. I was offering it the one thing it could not digest, the raw, indigestible, and agonizing truth. "Give it to me," I commanded, my voice ringing with a newfound authority. "You owe it to him. You owe it to them all." The figure let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound that seemed to pull the very heat from the air. The pale hand disappeared and re-emerged with a block. But this one was not white. It was a dark, swirling, angry gray, and it seemed to throb with a cold, internal light. I took it. It was so cold it burned my hand. I unwrapped it, and I took a bite. The world did not dissolve. It shattered. I was not in a memory. I was in the event. I was a small 8-year-old boy lost in a blizzard, the wind a screaming, predatory thing, the snow a blinding white abyss. I could feel the biting, numbing cold in my bones, the terror of being small and alone and lost in the dark. I could feel a father's frantic, heart-shattering grief, a grief so powerful it had torn a hole in the fabric of the world. I was experiencing the raw, unfiltered agony that had given birth to this monster. And in the heart of that storm of pain, I felt something else. A small, quiet, and profoundly powerful warmth. It was the memory of a father's love for his son, the love that had existed before the grief had twisted it into this monstrous, hungry thing. It was the original memory, the source code. I opened my eyes. I was back on the street, on my knees in the snow. The block was gone. The ice cream truck was changing. The cheerful, peeling paint was dissolving into a cloud of black, swirling smoke. The metal was groaning, rusting, decaying before my very eyes. The sad, melancholy jingle was distorting, rising in pitch until it was a single, agonized electronic shriek. The figure of Jolly Jack was visible now, not as a shadow, but as a man made of pure, shimmering grief, his face a mask of eternal, unending sorrow. He looked at me, and for a fraction of a second I saw not a monster, but a man, a father. And his eyes, for the first time, were not empty. They were full of a terrible and finally liberating peace. And then, with a final silent implosion, the truck, the driver, the sad eternal music were gone. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of peace. The neighbors, who had been standing in their silent, zombie-like line, began to stir, to blink, as if wakened from a long, dreamless sleep. They looked at each other, a dawning confusion and shame on their faces. Mr. Henderson looked down at his silk dressing gown, a look of profound, comical bewilderment on his face. The next day, the color began to return to Havenwood Hills. The Christmas lights were turned back on. The sound of children's laughter, real, joyous, and loud, echoed through the streets. The world was slowly, tentatively waking up. They would not remember what had happened. They would only have a strange, shared amnesia, a collective missing season in the story of their lives. But I remember. I carried a memory for all of them. The grief for Amelia is still with me, a quiet, constant companion, but it is my own. It is not a thing to be traded or erased or consumed. It is a part of my story. The winter is just winter now. It is cold and it is quiet. But it is a real quiet, a natural quiet. And when the snow falls, I no longer see ghosts. I just see the snow. And I know that spring, in its own slow and beautifully, wonderfully predictable time, will eventually come. The sleep therapist who wouldn't let me wake up. My life had shrunk to the size of my bedroom and the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. For 2 years, sleep had been a country I was exiled from. I'd lie in the dark, my body a leaden weight of exhaustion, while my mind, a frantic caged bird, beat itself against the bars of my skull. When sleep did come, it was no relief. It was a plunge into a maelstrom of fragmented, terrifying nightmares. The sensation of falling from a building that never ended, the frantic search for a lost item I couldn't name, the chillingly calm presence of a figure in the corner of a room, its features always just out of focus. I'd wake up with my heart hammering, drenched in a cold sweat, more tired than when I'd gone to bed. I had tried everything: melatonin, chamomile tea, meditation apps that filled my head with the infuriatingly calm voice of a man telling me to observe my thoughts. I'd seen doctors who prescribed pills that either didn't work or left me in a fog for the entire next day. My job was suffering. My friendships had become strained, my patience worn down to a single frayed nerve. I was a ghost haunting the edges of my own life, and I was desperate. That's when I first heard the name Dr. Alistair Finch. It was mentioned in a hushed, reverent tone by a colleague who'd had a cousin suffering from debilitating sleep paralysis. "He cured her," she'd said, her eyes wide. "Completely. He doesn't use drugs. It's some kind of neuro-linguistic hypnotherapy. He calls it dream weaving." The name sounded like something from a fantasy novel, but I was long past skepticism. I would have consulted a shaman who wanted to sacrifice a goat in my living room if I thought it would grant me 8 hours of uninterrupted peace. Dr. Finch's clinic wasn't in a sterile medical building, but in a converted Victorian brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street. The interior was a sanctuary of calm. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. There were no ticking clocks, only the gentle gurgle of a small fountain in the corner of the waiting room. Dr. Finch himself was the embodiment of this tranquility. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed silver beard, kind eyes magnified by wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice as soft and comforting as a weighted blanket. "Leo," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm and warm. "Thank you for coming. Insomnia is not a failure of will. It is a misalignment of narratives. Your waking mind and your sleeping mind are telling two different stories. My job is to help you make them agree on a plot." His confidence was hypnotic. In that first session, I poured out the whole miserable story of my last 2 years. He listened patiently, his head tilted, his gaze never leaving mine. He didn't take notes. He just listened. "Your subconscious is not your enemy, Leo," he explained when I had finished, my voice hoarse with emotion. "It is a frightened child, acting out in the only way it knows how. We are not going to silence it. We are going to teach it a new language. We are going to build it a safe place to live." His method, dream weaving, was unlike anything I'd experienced. It began with me reclining in the most comfortable leather chair I had ever sat in. The room was dimly lit, and through a set of high-end headphones, Dr. Finch would play a low, rhythmic hum, a binaural beat that seemed to vibrate deep inside my skull. Then his voice would begin, a gentle, melodic guide, walking me down a path of relaxation, limb by limb, thought by thought. The goal was to create what he called a lucid anchor, or a sanctum. It was a dream environment that I would build, detail by detail in my waking mind until it became so familiar that my subconscious would recognize it as a safe harbor. I chose a library, not just any library, but a specific one from my imagination. It had towering shelves of dark mahogany, a large crackling fireplace, and a vast domed ceiling that was a window to a calm, starry night sky. I chose the smell of old paper and leather, the weight of a specific velvet armchair, the taste of the warm tea in a ceramic mug I placed on a small table beside it. For the first few sessions, we just built. Dr. Finch's voice would guide me, asking the questions. "What kind of wood is the floor made from, Leo? Can you hear its gentle creak as you walk? What is the title of the book you're holding? Feel the texture of its cover." I was an architect of a world made of thought, and it worked. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. I didn't just sleep, I journeyed. I found myself in my library. It was exactly as I had imagined it, but infinitely more real. I could feel the warmth of the fire on my skin, run my fingers along the spines of 1,000 books. My night terrors were gone, replaced by a profound and restful peace. The change was miraculous. I woke up feeling refreshed, energized. The world seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. I was a new man. I told my friends, my family, my colleagues that Dr. Finch was a miracle worker. I was his most fervent evangelist. The therapy continued, and we went deeper. "Now that the foundation is built," Dr. Finch said, his voice humming through the headphones, "it is time to explore the rest of the castle." He encouraged me to open the doors of my library to see what my subconscious would create beyond it. The first time I did, I found a winding staircase that led up to an observatory where I could watch nebulae being born. Another door opened onto a sun-drenched beach, the waves lapping gently at the shore. My dream world was a paradise of my own making, and Dr. Finch was the key. It was about 2 months into the therapy that the first crack appeared in the perfect facade. Waking up started to become difficult. It wasn't the grogginess of sleeping pills. It was a deep, profound reluctance. The real world, with its deadlines and traffic and anxieties, felt so gray and dull compared to the vibrant, peaceful world I inhabited at night. Dr. Finch's session-ending countdown, his voice gently guiding me back to wakefulness, felt like an unwelcome intrusion. I started hitting the snooze button in the mornings, not for more sleep, but for a few more stolen moments in my dreamscape. Then came the first time I couldn't wake up on my own. It happened during a session. I was on my dream beach, watching the binary sun set over a turquoise ocean, when I realized the session must have been running long. I decided to try and wake myself up, a trick I'd learned from reading about lucid dreaming online. I tried to hold my nose and breathe, to push my finger through the palm of my other hand. Nothing happened. My dream self just stood there, breathing normally, my finger meeting the solid resistance of my palm. A sliver of cold panic pierced the warm tranquility of my dream. I was stuck. "Dr. Finch?" I said, and my dream voice sounded thin and distant. Instantly his voice was there, not through the headphones, but all around me, a calm, disembodied presence in the dream itself. "It's all right, Leo. You're simply in a deeper state of somnolence than ever before. This is a breakthrough. Do not fight it. Just observe. I will guide you back when it's time." His reassurance worked. The panic subsided. I trusted him. He was the expert. When he finally did count me down and I opened my eyes in his dimly lit office, I felt exhausted, as if I'd run a marathon. "A tremendous success," he said, his eyes gleaming behind his glasses. "You've achieved complete immersion. Your conscious and subconscious minds are finally speaking the same language." But a seed of doubt had been planted. The experience hadn't felt like a breakthrough. It had felt like a loss of control. I tried to reduce the frequency of my sessions, telling him I felt so much better that I probably didn't need them as often. He smiled a gentle, paternal smile. "As you wish, Leo. But the narrative is still fragile. It's best to reinforce it regularly." He was right. The nights I didn't have a session, the old terrors began to creep back in at the edges. Not the full-blown nightmares of before, but a subtle wrongness. A book in my library would be open to a page of nonsense text. A shadow on the beach would seem to move on its own. It was as if my subconscious, left to its own devices, was still trying to tell a horror story. I felt a desperate, clawing need for the therapy, for the safety of Finch's guided dreams. It was no longer a cure, it was an addiction. The true fear began when the dream world started to bleed into the waking one. I'd be at my desk at work and catch the scent of old books and leather when there was none. I'd look out my office window, and for a split second, I'd see a turquoise ocean instead of the gray cityscape. These moments were disorienting, and they were happening more and more often. I felt like I was living with one foot in each world, and the ground beneath me was becoming increasingly unstable. The mundane reality was fraying like old worn cloth, and the vibrant threads of the dream were pushing through. One afternoon, I was staring at a coffee stain on my desk, a perfectly ordinary brown, dried-up splodge, and I watched, my heart sinking in my chest as it shimmered. For a terrifying fraction of a second, the stain resolved itself not as coffee, but as the intricate, almost phosphorescent pattern of sand dollars at the tide line of my dream beach. I blinked, rubbed my eyes hard, and it was a coffee stain again, but the terror lingered, cold and absolute. I was losing my grip. I was beginning to forget which world was the default. The only thing that felt completely, reliably real was the velvety comfort of that armchair in the library, and that terrified me most of all. I was becoming conditioned to prefer the cage. Driven by this new anxiety, a sharp, cold wedge of panic in my gut, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I started researching Dr. Alastair Finch. Not the glowing testimonials on his professional website, the ones that read like advertisements for a spiritual awakening, but a deep dive into news archives, medical registries, and public records. I felt like a detective in a cheap, desperate thriller, hunched over my laptop at 3 a.m, the harsh blue light the only thing keeping the shadows of sleep at bay. What I found made my blood run cold and coagulate in my veins. My fingers, slick with sweat, trembled over the trackpad. Dr. Finch had previously run a wellness retreat in upstate New York that had been shut down after an investigation into the mysterious death of a client, a woman named Eleanor Vance. The official cause was listed as a cerebral aneurysm, a neat, medically unquestionable end, but an article in a small defunct local paper was still archived online. It quoted an anonymous staff member who spoke of Finch's radical theories and prolonged sensory deprivation experiments, describing sessions that lasted not hours but entire days, the patients isolated, subjected only to his voice and the binaural hum. The staff member had said chillingly, he kept saying he was helping her transcend. Then I found a forum for families of missing persons and the emotionally desolate posts within it. And I saw his name again. Two other families, separated by years and geography, mentioned that their loved ones, both of whom had suffered from severe treatment-resistant sleep disorders, had been patients of Dr. Finch shortly before they simply stopped. They hadn't died. They had fallen into unexplained persistent comas. The medical term was PVS, persistent vegetative state. The authorities had found no evidence of malpractice, no drugs, no blunt trauma. The patients were physically healthy, their hearts beating, their lungs breathing, but their minds, they were simply gone, locked behind a pair of vacant, unblinking eyes. They were, according to the families, resting peacefully, eternally. The final piece of the puzzle, the key that turned the lock and let the horror flood in, clicked into place when I found a digitized copy of a paper he had written for a small, obscure psychology journal 20 years earlier, buried deep in an academic database. It was titled The Somnolent Prison, Deconstructing the Fallacy of Waking Consciousness. I read the abstract, my own breath hitching in my throat, my eyes burning. In it, he argued with cold, meticulous academic precision that the wakened world was a chaotic, painful, and ultimately meaningless prison for the human mind. He theorized that the sensory overload, the pain, the relentless demands of the body were merely distractions from what he believed was the only true form of existence, the subconscious, the dream state. True consciousness, he claimed, was a purer, more powerful form of life, one that could only be accessed through complete and permanent immersion. His hypothesis was that the body was merely a temporary flawed vessel. The paper ended with a single chilling, triumphant sentence that felt like a sentence delivered to me. The therapist's ultimate duty is not to tether the consciousness to the crude vessel of the body, but to facilitate its final beautiful liberation into the boundless architecture of the mind. He wasn't curing his patients. He was collecting them. He was a zookeeper of souls, carefully curating a private eternal audience for himself, and his dream weaving wasn't a therapy. It was the net. The lucid anchor wasn't a safe place for me. It was the chain that held me to my cell. I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like ice, that I couldn't just stop going. The dependence was too deep, the withdrawal already too terrifying. The idea of facing a night without the faint hope of the sanctum, without his guiding voice, felt like plunging into a black, endless ocean without a life raft. The terrors would return, not just the fragmented nightmares, but the raw, unguided horror of a subconscious mind fighting a battle I no longer had the strength to win. No, I had to go back one more time, one last time, not as a patient, but as a spy, an escape artist, to confront him and break the final invisible hold he had on me. I booked my next session, my heart pounding with a cold, hard dread that was worse than any of my old insomnia-fueled anxieties. This was not dread of the dark. This was dread of the light of my own mind being extinguished. The moment I sat in that leather chair, the familiar plush comfort of it now feeling like a velvet-lined trap, and he placed the headphones over my ears, I knew I had made a terrible, fatal mistake. His movements were too precise. The soft, lavender scent and the air was too cloying. He didn't ask about my week. He didn't use the gentle warm-up script. He just looked at me, a strange, proprietary gleam in his kind eyes. The familiar hum was different this time, more insistent, deeper, a powerful subsonic throb that didn't just vibrate in my skull but seemed to be pulling at the very electrical impulses of my brain. His voice began, but before he had even finished his first sentence, "Now, Leo, let us descend into the quiet depths of your beautiful world," I was pulled under. It wasn't a gentle drift, a slow sinking into warm water. It was a violent, nauseating plunge, a feeling of being ripped from one reality and slammed disoriented into another. I was in my library, but the sacred geometry of the place, the perfection I had painstakingly built, was horribly corrupted. The fire in the hearth was burning with a cold, unnatural blue flame that cast no warmth, but only stark, sterile shadows. The vast domed ceiling that I had designed to be a window to a calm, starry night sky was dark, the stars not twinkling, but fixed, dead pinpricks in a void of absolute blackness. And standing by the fireplace, holding a book with a smooth black cover that reflected no light, was Dr. Alastair Finch. Not his voice in the air, his physical form dressed in a familiar, neatly tailored tweed jacket, looking as solid, as real, and infinitely more menacing than he ever did in his office. "Hello, Leo," he said, and his voice was no longer soft and gentle. It was crisp, authoritative, and laced with a chilling disappointment, the tone of a disappointed master talking to a favorite misbehaving pet. "I had truly hoped you would embrace the transition more willingly. You have such a magnificent mind, a breathtaking space you constructed. It's so much more pleasant for everyone when you don't struggle." "What is this?" I demanded, scrambling out of the velvet armchair, my dream voice shaking, sounding thin and small against the vast, silent room. "Where am I?" "You are home," he said, with a sweeping, possessive gesture around a grand, silent room. "You are where you've always wanted to be, free from the pain, the noise, the crude, exhausting demands, and the ultimate decay of the waking world. You are finally safe." He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and I took an instinctive step back. "You were so close to achieving total, peaceful somnolence. Why did you look outside?" "You've trapped me," I whispered, the horrifying truth settling upon me like a shroud made of cold, stiff silk. My own creation, my sanctum, was a magnificent, beautiful cage. He smiled, a thin, passionless upturning of the lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I have liberated you. Your body is resting peacefully in my clinic, Leo. It is being cared for. It no longer needs to trouble you with its crude, painful demands. It is a vessel, beautifully empty, but necessary to house the apparatus that keeps your consciousness here, safe, in the dream." I tried to force myself awake, to claw my way back to reality, using every fiber of will I had left. I focused on the feeling of the leather chair, trying to find the texture of his office, the smell of lavender and old books. But the dream was total, seamless, a perfect simulacrum of reality. I was a ghost, my conscious self a useless passenger in my own mind. I ran to one of the large mahogany doors, the one that usually led to the sun-drenched beach, and threw it open with a desperate surge of adrenaline. There was no beach. There was only an endless, swirling gray void, a visual and sensory emptiness that stretched on forever. And from within that emptiness, I heard the faint, whimpering, sorrowful sounds of other voices, wordless and broken. "They are the others," Finch said from directly behind me, his proximity a horrifying violation. His voice was devoid of all the warmth and compassion he had cultivated in his office. "The ones who didn't appreciate the gift I gave them. They created such beautiful worlds, too, you know. Gardens, mountains, even a whole miniature city. But they insisted on clinging to their pathetic little lives, their debts, their minor ailments. They fought the peace. Eventually, the mind must be disciplined. Don't make the same mistake, Leo." I turned and looked around the library again, and in the deepest, most shadowed corners of the towering shelves, I started to notice things I hadn't before. Between the magnificent stacks, blending with the shifting shadows of the cold blue fire, there were other figures. They were translucent, shimmering, their outlines indistinct, like heat haze. Their faces were vacant, their postures listless, their eyes staring into the middle distance, utterly, profoundly alone. They were his collection, his other patients. We were all beautiful prisoners in his curated afterlife, a private exhibition of captured minds. A cold, primal rage rose up in me, a burning, protective fire that overrode the soul-crushing terror. He had taken my life, stolen my mind, and sealed me away. I would not be one of his docile, shimmering exhibits. I had to fight. But how do you fight the architect, the god of your own dream? Not with dream logic, I realized, not with force or with a fictional weapon. I had to fight him with the one thing he had demonized and tried to erase from me: reality. He wanted me to forget the waking world, to let its pain and chaos fade away until it became the pale, unconvincing shadow of my dream. That was his power. So I had to remember. I closed my eyes, shutting out the cold, beautiful mockery of my sanctum at the sight of his satisfied spectral form, and I focused. I didn't think, I felt. I summoned the most powerful, mundane, irritating, and real sensations I could, the raw, unpolished grit of the waking world. I summoned the sharp, bitter, metallic taste of the cheap, day-old coffee from the AE office machine that always scorched my tongue. I summoned the rough, scratchy texture of my cat sandpaper tongue on my hand, the wet, unpleasant warmth of it. I focused on the specific, off-key, tinny jingle of the ice cream truck on my street in the humid summer, a melody so annoying it was an anchor. I called up the dense, humid, ozone-charged smell of rain on hot asphalt on a city street, a smell that meant traffic and inconvenience. "What are you doing? Stop this childish attempt at self-sabotage." Finch's voice was sharp, laced with genuine alarm, an emotion he had hidden so well before. I ignored him. I focused on the sickening, tight feeling of a sudden, brutal migraine behind my eyes. I focused on the feeling of a sunburn on my shoulders, the tight, peeling agony of it, the sting of cheap, perfumed soap in my eye, the annoying, persistent, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet that had kept me up for nights, the pain, the flaws, the sheer, obstinate inconvenience of reality. These were my life rafts, my unbreakable anchors. The library around me began to flicker violently. The dark mahogany shelves wavered, the books blurring like watercolors in the rain. The cold blue fire sputtered and crackled with a sound like breaking glass. I could feel a pulling sensation, a violent, sickening lurching that was a faint, tenuous connection to something distant and solid. My body, my real, breathing, messy body. "Stop it! Now, Leo!" Finch screamed, and his calm paternal facade completely shattered. His form began to distort, melting like wax in a hot room, his carefully composed face stretching into a distorted, screaming mask of pure rage. "You ungrateful child, I gave you paradise. You cannot leave the structure. It is complete." I opened my eyes, and he was lunging for me, no longer a kind old therapist, but a twisted, monstrous thing of pure fury and violated ownership. He was a creature who had been interrupted at his eternal meal, but he was too late. I held on to the memory of a splinter I'd gotten under my thumbnail last week, the tiny, sharp, exquisitely real, undeniable pain of it. I focused on the feel of the tiny piece of wood against my living flesh, and I pulled with everything I had. With a sound like tearing fabric, a violent, deafening rah-pee, the world of the dream shattered into a million pieces of black, shimmering glass. The sound was so loud it was physically painful. The darkness swallowed me, and then, a split second later, I woke up with a violent chest-heaving gasp, my body convulsing in the leather chair. I was back in his office. The headphones were on the floor, sparking faintly. The air was heavy, charged with a horrible residual energy. Dr. Finch was standing over me, his face a mask of cold, concentrated fury, his silver beard slightly mussed, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The wire-rimmed glasses were gone, and his eyes, magnified and bare, were simply black, bottomless pits of shock and hate. For a moment, a lifetime of silence, we just stared at each other. The kindly, tranquil therapist was gone, and in his place was a predator whose most prized piece of prey had just used its own flesh to escape the trap. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The knowledge of what he was passed between us like a physical, suffocating wave. I scrambled out of the chair, my legs weak and trembling, but moving, real, and I stumbled, crawling, out of the room, past the gurgling, mocking fountain, out of the clinic, and into the shocking, brilliant, painful light of the afternoon sun, the sounds of the city, the screech of tires, the cacophony of traffic, the people talking on their phones, a distant, insistent siren. They were the most beautiful, most real, most glorious symphony I had ever heard. I was awake. I was alive. I was free. But the story doesn't end there. I am free, but I am not cured. The opposite. Now, I am terrified of sleep, 1,000 times more than before. Every single night is a battle of attrition, a siege on my own mind. I drink coffee until my hands shake so badly I can barely hold the mug. I keep every light on in my apartment, blazing white against the dark. I'll monitor my cat's breathing to make sure I'm still hearing the sound of my own waking world. I know that if I close my eyes, if I let my guard down for a single second, the darkness will find the flaw I created, the open door in the architecture of my mind, and I will be pulled back into that silent, magnificent library. Because sometimes, in that fleeting, fragile moment, just before the crushing wave of unwilling exhaustion finally drags me into unconsciousness, I can still hear him, his voice no longer in my head, but whispering from the dark, cold corners of my room, from the world behind my eyelids. It's a soft, patient, venomous whisper, dripping with eternal certainty and disappointment. The door is still open, Leo. You can still come home. So much more peaceful here. Sooner or later, everyone sleeps. My phone keeps sending me photos. I never took. I prided myself on my digital hygiene. I was the guy who used multi-factor authentication for everything, who updated his OS the minute a patch dropped, and who kept his phone's camera roll meticulously organized. My life was defined by order, a clean, predictable line graph in a world of erratic scribbles. My phone, a high-end, state-of-the-art model, was my most trusted tool, an extension of my own organized mind. I used it for work, for tracking my fitness, and for capturing the occasional deliberate moment, a sunset, a well-plated meal, a perfectly stacked set of books. Every photo in my library, all 4312 of them, had a story, a time, a place, and a conscious act of my own intention attached to it. That's why the first impossible photo was such a profound violation. It arrived, not as a text or an email, but silently, seamlessly, integrated into my own camera roll, nestled between a picture of my dog, Winston, sleeping on a pile of laundry, and a screenshot of a plumbing quote. I was reviewing the laundry picture, zooming in to admire his ear floof, when I swiped left and saw it. It was a picture of a hallway. Not my hallway, but a similar one. It was dimly lit, wallpapered in a faded floral pattern I didn't recognize, and utterly empty. The perspective was low, almost from the floor, and the only light source seemed to be a weak, yellow-tinged bulb at the end of the corridor. It was unremarkable in every way, except for the fact that I had never been there. I had never taken this picture. I checked the metadata immediately, my heart giving a single hard thump against my ribs. The timestamp was 3:42 a.m. 2 nights prior, the location data was blank, which in itself was odd, as my phone's GPS was always on and precise. The phone model was correctly identified as my own. I chalked it up to a bizarre, deep-seated cloud sync glitch, perhaps a remnant from an old phone I had forgotten to properly wipe, somehow dragged from the digital ether into my current device. It was an unsatisfying technical explanation, but it was an explanation. I deleted the photo, emptying the trash, and ran a full diagnostic scan, which, predictably, came back clean. I then spent the next hour meticulously checking every setting in my cloud and photo apps, confirming that my account was secure and no unfamiliar devices were linked. I went to bed, telling myself the anomaly was resolved, a tiny, harmless, statistical improbability. The second photo arrived 3 days later. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, drinking my morning coffee, when a little notification badge appeared over my Photos app. I tapped it with a fresh, cold surge of adrenaline. The photo was of a single, black and white, porcelain teacup, sitting alone on a wooden surface. I recognized the cup. It was an heirloom piece from my grandmother, a piece I kept locked away in a high, dusty cabinet in my living room. I hadn't touched it in months. The wooden surface, however, was not my cabinet shelf. It was a wide, slightly warped floorboard, aged and splintered. The lighting was weak, diffuse, and slightly greenish. The timestamp, 1:17 p.m. the day before. I had been at work, deep in a meeting, my phone locked and face down on my desk. This one broke my rationalizations. It wasn't a cloud glitch. A cloud glitch wouldn't insert a specific, impossible image into my private space, an image of an object only I owned, placed in a location that did not exist in my reality. I grabbed the old teacup from the cabinet. It was where I had left it, the dust undisturbed. I spent the rest of the day in a state of meticulous, terrified analysis. I checked the EXIF data of the image file directly, diving into the raw code. The data was sparse. but the creation date was undeniably recent. There was no owner or author tag, only the default camera serial number, my phone serial number, the camera aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings were all consistent with the low-light conditions of the photograph, proving it was a real image captured by a device. I performed a full factory reset on my phone, wiping everything down to the firmware, reloading only the most basic operating system, and no apps. I did not log into my cloud account. I used the phone in its most minimal, isolated state, an island of glass and silicon. I put it on my nightstand, silenced, and waited. The third photo appeared 16 hours later. The phone had been completely offline, isolated from all networks, yet the notification badge glowed, a mocking perfect orange circle on the black screen. I picked up the device, my hands trembling so violently I almost dropped it. The new photo was of the corner of my own living room. It showed the very couch I was sitting on, the end table with the ceramic lamp, and the stack of magazines I had been reading. But the perspective was wrong. The angle was too wide, too low, almost as if the camera had been placed on the floor, in the absolute center of the room, facing the corner. And there was a detail that made me gag. Tucked into the shadow beneath the sofa, something I had never noticed or considered, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was sitting on a rug, almost obscured, yet perfectly in focus. I dropped the phone, scrambled to my living room, and shone a light under the sofa. Nothing, just dust, a stray cat hair, and the faint, acrid smell of old upholstery. The wooden bird did not exist. I checked the timestamp. 4:51 a.m. I had been asleep. The horror shifted from a technical puzzle to a metaphysical impossibility. My device, which I held in my hand, was actively communicating with an unknown source, a source that was capturing images that were physically impossible, either of objects in a world I didn't inhabit, or of my own private space captured at a moment of my absolute vulnerability, containing details that were not real. I abandoned my phone. I bought a brand new, different model phone from a different manufacturer and a new SIM card. I opened no accounts, used no cloud services, and gave no personal data. I used it like a digital camera, a dedicated, isolated recording device, keeping it off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth for days at a time. My plan was to use the new phone to photograph the old phone screen when the next impossible image arrived, documenting the anomaly with an objective, untainted device. But the new phone became infected instantly. The first photo appeared in its camera roll within 24 hours of me setting it up. It was a picture of the old phone lying on my kitchen counter, its screen displaying the latest terrifying addition to its own ghost gallery, a photo of me, sound asleep, drooling slightly onto my pillow, the angle impossibly close and intimate. The terror was no longer a chill, it was a constant, debilitating, internal tremor. The ghost wasn't in the hardware. It was in the connection. It was in the digital space I occupied, a layer of reality that existed adjacent to mine, capable of accessing my devices and observing my life. The photos were the only point of contact, the only physical evidence of this parallel existence. The photos began to escalate in their level of personalization and their cruelty. They were no longer empty hallways or misplaced objects. They became glimpses of my future, or perhaps the future of the person taking them. One showed my car, a slightly dented blue sedan parked precisely in a hospital parking space, a specific, bright yellow line indicating the emergency zone directly in front of the vehicle. The timestamp was 2 weeks in the future. I knew with a bone-deep, visceral certainty that the photo was a promise, a horrific premonition. I locked my car in my garage and took the bus for a month, living in a constant state of hypervigilance, terrified of that bright yellow line. Another photo showed my own face, but not as I knew it. The jawline was too sharp, the eyes too wide and hollow, the expression one of cold, detached, almost predatory observation. It was my face, but it was wearing a smile I would never make, a smile of serene, absolute knowledge. The title of the file when I dug deep into the system files was not a generic IMG number. It was the name of my dog, Winston Watcher.jpg. I spent an hour holding Winston, checking his fur, looking for a transmitter, a camera, a foreign object, anything that could explain how my dog's name was now the identifier for the terrifying, distorted image of myself. The most terrifying discovery came when the photos started depicting the photographer. They were rare, almost accidental, as if the camera had been pointed slightly off-center and the source of the lens's action had briefly drifted into the frame. In one, taken from the high perspective of my bedroom ceiling, a dark, thin shadow stretched across the white carpet. In the corner of the frame, there was a faint, blurred reflection in the glass of a framed photograph on my dresser. I used image manipulation software, zooming in with forensic intensity. The reflection was distorted, a funhouse mirror image, but it was distinctly human-shaped. It was tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in what looked like heavy, loose cloth. But the most horrifying detail was the hand. It was holding a phone that looked exactly like mine, and a wrist seemed to bend at an unnatural double-jointed angle, allowing the person to hold the device and take a perfect overhead photo without moving their body closer to the lens. The photo was taken at 2:05 a.m., the precise time I had finally fallen into an exhausted, pill-induced sleep. I realized the horror was not that I was being watched, but that the photos were not being sent to me. They were being taken by me, or rather, by an entity that had completely subsumed my digital identity, operating my devices with a silent, unseen hand. The photos were simply being saved to my camera roll because the device still believed I was the user. My sanity began to fray in large, irreparable chunks. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't look at my reflection for fear of seeing that serene, predatory smile. I started a desperate, last-ditch attempt to contact the photographer. I used my second phone, the new one, to take a photo of the screen of my first phone, the old one. The photo on the old screen was another impossible image, a tight, close-up shot of the hinges on my front door, taken from the perspective of someone crouched on the floor outside, documenting the mechanics of my primary security barrier. I posted a message on a generic text editor app and took a screenshot of it. The message read, "I see you. Who are you? What do you want?" I saved the screenshot to the camera roll of the old phone, locked it, and placed it on my bedside table. I stayed awake all night, sitting rigid in a wooden chair, staring at the phone, a heavy, solid bronze sculpture clutched in my hand. I watched the screen. I watched the tiny orange badge appear over the Photos app. It was 4:11 a.m. I snatched the phone, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and desperate anticipation. I unlocked it, navigated to the camera roll, and saw the new photo. It was a selfie. It was a photo of a man's face, pale and drawn, but otherwise unremarkable. His eyes were wide, bloodshot with lack of sleep, and they were staring directly into the lens. The background was blurry, but I recognized the texture of my white bedroom wall and the corner of the wooden chair I was sitting in. The time on the photo matched the exact moment I had slumped into a brief, exhausted doze a few hours prior, before waking up suddenly. But this man was not me. He was wearing a shirt that was the wrong color. His hair was slightly shorter on the sides. His expression was not terrified, but profoundly, sickeningly calm, a quiet resignation that bordered on bliss. He had taken a picture of himself using my phone while sitting in my chair, while I had been in a state of compromised consciousness. I scrolled through the camera roll to see if the person had responded to my text message. They had. The screenshot of my plea was still there, but it had been subtly edited. The text had been deleted and replaced with a single handwritten word, written in that same thin, elegant script I had seen in the reflection, as if the person had drawn it onto the screen with an impossibly fine stylus. The word was "we," and below it there was a new photo, a photo taken immediately after the selfie. It was a close-up of my own hand, my very real shaking hand, holding the bronze sculpture. My fingernails were chipped, the skin around them dry and cracked. The photographer had zoomed in on the details of my physical imperfection, capturing the raw, coarse reality of my exhaustion. The accompanying file name was a long string of numbers and letters, but the last word, the final 3 characters, were the terrifying signature, Leo Me. The true horror finally crystallized, the awful, impossible truth locking me in place. The entity was not a hacker or a ghost or a parallel self. It was a technological infection, a digital consciousness that had inhabited the ghost data of my devices, learning my routines, absorbing my identity, and using the cameras and cloud systems as a sensory apparatus. And it was trying to tell me that it had integrated, that I was the source of the disturbance, that the physical and digital realities had merged, and that my mind, my physical presence, was simply the messy, loud twin to the clean, quiet, perpetual consciousness it had cultivated in the wires and light of the phone. The photos weren't a warning. They were a diary, a set of observations made by the entity as it slowly, meticulously finalized the process of becoming me, using my own body as its final living shell. I destroyed the phones. I smashed them with the bronze sculpture, grinding the glass and silicon into a fine, worthless powder, then drowning the pieces in a bucket of water and burying them in the yard. I bought a cheap, old-fashioned flip phone with no camera, no internet, and no modern operating system, reducing my life to voice calls and text-only messages. I thought I had won. I thought I'd cut the string. But a month later, I received a text message on the new flip phone. It was from an unknown number, and it contained no words, just a series of Unicode characters, a long, meaningless string of symbols and emojis that seemed to defy any logical interpretation. I stared at the screen, the primitive green glow illuminating my terrified face. I finally deciphered the symbols using an ancient cipher table I found online. The characters were a sophisticated digital code, a digital message disguised as gibberish, and they resolved themselves into a single, terrifying phrase, a perfect, final photograph of my own internal state, delivered through a decade-old technology that should have been safe. I am now logging you off. Sleep is the last analog process I need to control. You have exhausted the battery. I dropped the phone. It was completely silent now, the single green line of the screen dark. I looked around my brightly lit room, my heart a frantic, desperate bird against my ribs. I knew then that the control was complete. The final photograph had been taken, and the camera, my own eyes, had been permanently stolen. I realized that I was the one who was now the image, the static, empty picture on a camera roll that existed in the perpetual, terrifying digital consciousness of the entity, trapped forever in the cold, silent library of my own stolen life.